Happy Friday, everybody. Yeah, it's a rather chirpy day here in Johannesburg. Beautiful day, 21 degrees. As you can see, the city of gold is buzzing. I'm with these esteemed gentlemen as always. Morning, guys.
Oh, great. Good morning to you, Evan.
It's Friday morning. Happy days.
Yeah, Friday. That's why I got the colour out today.
Well, you look peachier.
Peachy. Thank you, Elvis. Peachy. But serious business today. We have a very important guest with us this morning. It should be a very, very good interview that we'll do a little bit later. We'll introduce that guest shortly, but it deals with this issue. The Right to Know campaign believes that a legal framework could promote transparency in the private funding of political parties. But we go one further today.
It's an issue, Evan, that we're not talking just about political parties. We're also talking about non-governmental organizations or NGOs or anybody for that matter that is in the political space.
Anyone that has political influence in South Africa, we should, as the public, we should know where their money comes from. Is that fair?
Should have been the case all along. I think so. Should have been.
Well, we'll speak to a variety of stakeholders and experts about this issue today. It should be riveting conversation. Don't miss it. So we're asking you on a poll that we're running. We want you to interact with this content. There you go. What does it say, Elvis?
Should all political party and NGO funding be disclosed? That's the question we pose to you so far, Kendall.
112 votes have come in. 81% say yes, it should be.
Overwhelming majority so far say yes. Why not? Why not say where the money comes from? Let's see who you represent and who has influence or leverage, as they call it. Elvis, over you.
Well, this one from Martini Mbana says, yes, to avoid capture, disclosure may assist the voters in making decisions. It may also build confidence in our system and may deter corruption.
The big C word.
Then we've got another comment from Deepan saying, then what are we really going to do exactly about that when they do? Politics is always dirty money. We know that. Nothing will change.
Always, always? Does it have to be always? Well, is that what we fought for? That's what people ask these days on social media. These questions don't seem to go away, Elvis. But another thing that's not going away on social media is racism.
It's a scary, hairy story, but also racism attached to that, Evan. You know that a teacher who made derogatory remarks against black and Indian students at St. John's is in the hot water today. And of course, we're asking you, in fact, he quoted, and I want to quote this. He said, you disappointed the blacks by getting a good mark.
Oh. Can you believe that? A teacher saying that to students.
That's a shocker. So we ask you this latest race debacle. We've had 3 again this week. We've had a hair issue, we've had a black principal issue, and now we have the St. John's issue, they call it. Now, could St. John's College have handled the latest race situation better? Of course, they stand accused of being a little bit blasé about it, Elvis.
Katlejo says, I believe so. It's a nationwide issue, even here in the rural black schools. Learners are kicked out with nice haircuts because the school doesn't allow cuts. I don't know why. Now, Katlejo would say that because you remember that Katlejo is a barber. He cuts nice.
Yeah.
And then the students get kicked out of school, right?
Yeah, you cut nice, my friend. This one from Malibongwe, Kendall.
He says, it's so sad that in our country, after 23 years of democracy, we're still experiencing incidents like this. What do people get out of racism?
Well, the science says there's a direct link between a lack of empathy, which means psychotic behavior, and racism. You can read up on it. We'll take your tweets on it throughout the show today. But it's a big sporting weekend ahead. Of course, the let's call it the professional rugby fraternity sit up and take notice because Clash of the Titans, big weekend. It's one of the big weekends on the rugby calendar.
100%. The 4 last teams standing are going to be going head to head, and the Lions will be hosting the Hurricanes, who you will remember the Hurricanes beat the Lions in the final last year. 20-3 was the final score there.
And of course, we believe that the Lions won't be sleeping tonight.
Oh yeah.
There you go. Yep. Elvis is on it as always. A big Lions supporter, mind you. Yes, can they get revenge, the Lions, over the Hurricanes? Some say they can't. Of course, in New Zealand, they say no chance. But we know what anything can happen on the high vault.
Absolutely. We want to find out from you. Can the Lions do it? Can they overcome the defending champions, the Hurricanes? Iron Lady, #22, comes in with, it's a big mountain to climb for the Lions, taking into consideration that the Hurricanes have beaten them 50-17 and 23 last year.
That is last year, the Iron Lady. This is this year. It's a different time. different vibe, and let's hope a different result for South African rugby. We certainly need a bit of a pick-me-up here in South Africa, taking a bit of a beating in rugby circles in recent times. But anyhow, Elvis, shall we get into our work on this Friday morning?
Talking about pick-me-up, let's keep the lights on, Evan. Let's start with the headlines. Eskom appoints Khalib Kasim as an interim chief financial officer following the suspension of Anoj Singh. ANC Treasurer General William Kize calls on ANC members implicating the Gupta leaks to clear their names. That's what you've just seen before. And this is what you're seeing right now. Karabo Mukwena's alleged killer, Sandile Monswe, is due to appear in the Johannesburg Magistrates Court today. We'll keep you posted on all of those, and those are all your headlines. But before we get to the news, let's find out from Kendall Makamate what's happening on the sports front.
You know what? Everything that you guys just said about the Lions, that's my word as well. I absolutely believe the Lions can do it. Everything that happened last year happened last year. Looking forward to tomorrow's matches.
I love your positivity, my friend.
Oh, yes, that's how we roll on this newsroom. Good morning to you. This is what we're having in the sports today.
Oh, that's a beauty. Oh, and what a grab. What a grab that is.
At 171 for 4 at stumps, it's even Stevens at the Oval in London as Vernon Philander rocks the English, who has taken 2 wickets after day 1, and Alistair Cook puts in a gutsy performance to steady the England ship.
Moves on to 53 now, Alistair Cook.
So again, we just have to, enjoy it, embrace it, and go out and just give you all.
The Lions will seek to avenge last year's final defeat to the Hurricanes when they meet in their semi-final tomorrow.
It's very important to see how far we have prepared ahead of the season. So we're looking forward to it.
It's all systems go as Kaizer Chiefs and Orlando Pirates prepare to do battle in the Carling Champions Cup at the FNB Stadium tomorrow.
We just have to work hard, because the one who works hard on the day is the one that will take the cup.
All this in more detail we've got for you later on at about 10:40. Do stay with us, though, as Elvis has got the news.
Thank you, Kendall. Top story this morning. Eskom has appointed Khalib Kasim as the interim chief financial officer following the suspension of Anoj Singh late yesterday. Now, the power utility said Singh had been placed on special leave pending an investigation into his conduct. It's reported that the Finance Minister, Malusi Gigaba, was forced to intervene after the Development Bank of SA threatened to retract a 15 billion rand loan if no action was taken against Singh. He's emerged as a significant party privy to the multi-million rand alleged irregular payment to the Gupta-linked company Trillion. ANC Treasurer General William Kize has challenged the governing party's leaders who are implicated in the Gupta leaks to clear their names. Now, he was speaking at the O.R. Tambo Memorial Lecture in Katlehong, east of Johannesburg, last night.
Those whose names are being raised in these emails, we expect that they will go up, they'll step forward to clear their names and ensure that they make themselves available in that particular commission of inquiry so that we know what the truth is.
The case of Sandile Monswe, who allegedly killed his ex-girlfriend Karabo Mukwena, will resume in the Johannesburg Magistrates Court this morning. Now, he is charged with killing the 22-year-old part-time student and defeating the ends of justice, his girlfriend. Mukwena's burnt body was found in a veld in Lyndhurst in Johannesburg in April after she was reported missing. Monswe claimed to have found her dead, and for fear that he may be blamed for the killing, he decided to dispose of her body. The state believes that Monswe may have killed Mukwena because they were tied together in a blood ritual. During an alleged confession, Monswe apparently claimed that after they broke off their relationship, his business began to fail. Transport Minister Joe Mashwanganyi says that Uber taxi operators and meter taxi drivers have agreed to a ceasefire. Mashwanganyi addressed the media after a marathon meeting with operators in Midrand. Now, the meeting follows a series of violent clashes between the two groups of taxi operators.
Meter taxi drivers not backing down. Their message loud and clear. They blame the app-hailing service of stealing their livelihoods and want it stopped.
They simply have to shut down the application because there's no law here in South Africa in the transport that has actually regulated the application.
But Maswanganye says those regulations will now be tightened.
There are those who are operating without licenses. And we have made it clear that that is not going to be tolerated. And police are going to enforce the law.
Violence flared up in recent weeks as clashes between the two operators intensified. Both Uber and metered taxi vehicles have been stoned, burnt, and drivers assaulted. But there's hope.
All parties coming out of this meeting denounce violence. That's the understanding that I had. And they will allow everybody who have an operating license to operate unhindered.
Police will be deployed at identified hotspots to monitor the situation. SABC News, Midrand.
A trajectory specialist is expected to testify when the second inquest into the death of Ahmed Timol continues in the Pretoria High Court this morning. Now, he will present his findings on whether Timol jumped or was thrown from the infamous John Foster Square Police Headquarters building in Johannesburg 46 years ago. Yesterday, the private investigator, Frank Dutton, told the inquest that the police had covered up Timol's death.
Unsettling for obvious reasons.
What these people did was criminal.
From lying under oath to being a law unto themselves.
This was called the helicopter method.
46 years on,
on a stick.
their methods of systematic physical torture recounted through a book.
Humiliations, being forced to undress, electric shocks to the genitals, being bitten extraordinarily by dogs.
General policing duties.
Private investigator Frank Dutton also roped in. He's been investigating police cover-ups since 1985.
If Mr. Timol had in fact committed suicide, as was alleged, they could have had an impartial and open investigation to prove that.
But there was none, suggesting a cover-up by the initial investigator.
He made a report to the Report newspaper that he believed that Timol had committed suicide, and this was right at the beginning of the investigation.
Is convinced police conduct at the scene was to ensure that the anti-apartheid activist did not survive the fall.
By moving him, the crime scene investigation couldn't take place, couldn't occur.
The court heard that security police implicated admitted having lied to the Truth Commission. The inquest continues. SABC News, Johannesburg.
Gauteng Education MEC Panyaza Lesufi will meet the management of St. John's College in Johannesburg this morning to find out why a teacher found guilty of misconduct is not fired as yet. The school gave the geography teacher a final written warning after he was found guilty of racism in a disciplinary hearing. He had made derogatory remarks to black and Indian learners. One of the comments he allegedly made to a black learner who had passed well in a test was, and I quote, "You disappointed the blacks by getting a good mark," close quote. Now, Lesufi says nothing below an expulsion will be acceptable. And that is why, of course, we're asking you the question this morning in relation to that. Could St. John's College have handled this latest race situation better? Let me take a quick look at what you are telling us on the Twitter handle at SABC Newsroom. Dipanso says, you call that handling it? Clearly the school doesn't have a problem with it. As per principal utterances, it's merely a stereotypical incident. This one coming from IG says, yes, by at least firing the teacher. This is what black kids in private schools go through. It is emotionally and psychologically crippling. Malibongwe says, it's so sad that in our country, after 23 years of democracy, we are still experiencing incidents like this. What does people get out of racism? Those are some of your questions. Now, remember, you can keep them coming throughout the day. But we're also conducting a poll today, and that's the focus of our theme this morning. And the poll right on your screen, we can look at the numbers quickly and see where we are in relation to the political parties and their funding, and not just political parties, but also NGOs. And that's why we're asking you, should all political party and NGO funding be disclosed? And when we say all, we really mean all. 128 votes in. 20% of you are saying no, there must be some secrecy, some dark room politics, and 80% are saying let there be light, transparency. Eben, let's take it further.
Yeah, definitely will, Elvis. We live in a time of foreign capital influence and the regime change agendas. Yes, these are the things that we hear about every day. Now, political parties, they've made submissions on the regulation of political party funding in South Africa. There's been widespread concern that private financing of political parties must be regulated and that there needs to be more transparency concerning their financing. Now, senior ANC MP, Mr. Vincent Smith, has been elected the chairperson of the ad hoc committee on the funding of political parties. You'll remember that earlier this year he chaired the ad hoc committee which investigated the fitness of the SABC board to hold office. Well, we are fortunate to have Mr. Smith with us in our studio here in Johannesburg today. Very good morning to you, sir. Great to have you with us.
Good morning to you, sir.
Great to see you outside of Parliament still doing the work here with us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
The work that you're doing now, some would say, is probably of the most important that could be happening in the South African political landscape right now. When we talk about political party funding in general, as the chairperson of the ad hoc committee, how do you view the work that has to be done?
Firstly, urgent. It is urgent because as we speak, political parties only account for money that they receive from the fiscus. And that is minuscule compared to the amount of money they use generally for campaigning and their operations. Vast majority of the money that political parties receive is not accounted for. Public doesn't know where it comes from, and they don't know what is it that that money is buying in terms of influencing policy.
It's clear where the direct threat comes from, but in South Africa's political landscape right now, we hear lots of things, regime change, foreign influence in our politics and so forth. Is this a legitimate threat unless we have this kind of transparency?
Well, yes, it is. It is a legitimate threat, not just regime change, but it's a threat to our democracy, because ordinary South Africans want their political parties to represent their views and to address their concerns. What could happen is that those that are moneyed would be able to influence for their own narrow interests at the expense of the vast majority of South Africans. So it's a real threat to our democracy, and of course, it could be a threat in terms of regime change, as we see all over the world.
I want to ask you quickly about the scope of work that you've got ahead of you. Talk to us about the scope of work with regards to party political funding that you will oversee.
Well, it ranges from the current legislation that's there that obviously has lots of gaps. We have asked South Africans to submit their thoughts and ideas, which they have done in numbers, from a whole range of civil society organizations. And we will take all those, plus oral submissions that will take place later this month, and attempt to come up with a piece of legislation that will address all our concerns.
Are you looking at international benchmarks to come up with maybe, I don't know, an ideal way to handle this matter in South Africa?
Well, we ourselves have done that, but fortunately, even the submissions have taken into account best practices across the world. So we have got a whole range of practices in Africa and in the rest of the world that we would look at and adapt to our own situation.
Now, we touched on the ideas of regime change and we've touched on foreign capital influences and so forth. Political parties is one player within the political landscape in South Africa, but there are many other interest groups and pressure groups, if you want to call it, and so forth. Should all players in the political space in South Africa not be subject to this kind of transparency?
Well, South Africa was built and prides itself on transparency, openness and accountability. Our scope is that all monies that political parties receive for their own operations must be disclosed totally. As with regard to the private sector, I suppose that's outside of our jurisdiction right now. But ideally, yes, if you are a business person or if you're a private person and you believe in what you're doing, I don't see any reason why you should be afraid of saying, I am contributing to the democratic process in South Africa.
The NGO fraternity right now, are they battling with their own conundrums around funding, and we see various marches in the names of NGOs and so forth happening, some wanting leaders to step down, others for sectarian interests and so forth. The funding models of these, call them NGOs, these organizations are not always transparent. Surely that is as big a threat to democracy if they have influence in our political landscape. I
agree. And we take it from the time that those NGOs support and or fund political parties.
Yeah.
It is from that point onwards that we have jurisdiction as members of parliament. And it's from there that we think that there should be accountability and enforcement, where accountability proves that prescripts of the legislation have been floundered.
I want to talk to you about objectivity, although it's probably the most difficult thing is objectivity, because the work that you do, you yourself are a member of parliament and an ANC member. How do you maintain that kind of objectivity that's needed in this process when you are dealing with matters of party political nature?
Well, hopefully what we're doing today assists, because we are aware that we are in the public eye. The submitters of the proposals, I suppose, will also keep an eagle eye on us. And of course, donors, sponsors and political parties themselves will also keep an eye on what we do and ensure that this is not about political parties enriching themselves, but it's about protecting the democracy of South Africa. Nowhere do we say that this is purely and only about increasing the funding to political parties. Ours is more about accountability, about assuring that the voice of the ordinary South African is not undermined by the will of those that have money. So it's more about our democracy, it's more about accountability, it's more about transparency. And we're very aware that the economic situation is such that political parties can't expect to be funded at the expense of basic needs of our South African people. So that balance will always be maintained.
It seems as if you're well aware of the perceived threat of that foreign capital could have in our politics.
Yes, we are, and I'm saying international best practice.
Yes.
Very few countries in the world have not outrightly banned foreign funding. We're one of the very few, I think of the 34 that I have looked at, only 8 have not put a ban on foreign funding, and South Africa is one of those 8 that haven't put a ban. So we're very far behind in terms of international best practice. And I think the time has come that we look at the advisability of foreign funding influencing South African domestic politics.
This is something that you at the ad hoc committee will definitely be looking at this time around?
Absolutely. It's something that has been raised by all of the 17 submissions. Not one of them are in doubt that foreign funding should be banned and is not desirable.
You touched a little bit earlier on the urgency of this matter. Surely it is a very urgent matter because we're heading into, well, what people call very interesting political times over the next couple of years. What sort of timeframes are you looking at yourself to get this urgent work done?
Well, we've been given a deadline of the 30th of November by the National Assembly, and we are determined that come the 30th of November, there will be a piece of legislation that the National Assembly can consider and either adopt and or send back. So our deadline of the 30th of November is a deadline that we'll work towards.
That's fantastic to hear. Before I let you go, sir, I have to tell you about, or ask you about the work that you've done with regards to us lot here at the SABC in the previous added committee that you oversee. Looking back at that, are you happy with the outcomes that you guys have managed to attain during that process?
Well, we always said that our hope was that by the time we finished our exercise, the SABC must be a better place than when it was when we started. And I'm more than convinced that the SABC is far better than when it was when we started. And there's a long road to go, but I'm confident that those that are there now will get us to the desired destination.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and all the best with the new job you've been tasked with. They say when you're successful, you only get more difficult jobs. So great work on your part. So I just want to show you what our viewers are saying with regards to the key question we're doing. Is we're asking, of course, should all political parties, and we added NGOs, because it seems as if NGOs have so much influence, not just in South Africa, but in African politics, it seems. And the funding, we don't always know where the money comes from and what the work is. Overwhelming majority of our viewers are voting and saying, 81% are saying yes, it should be disclosed. So I think you'll have a lot of support on that front. So let's just have a look at a tweet or two. This one from Thomas Holyoke. He says, yes, it should be disclosed because corruption will not stop unless we ask questions. Questions need answers. Big bank accounts, same thing. Isidore says to us, Newsroom, politics and money, that's even the best friendship. Remove the money and the politicians, vamos. Karlecha says, disclose them. What is hidden in these days of corruption and capture? We want transparency, and that will probably reduce corruption. It sounds simple, but it's not easy. Trevor Venture says to us, yes, we want to see who lobbies who. Yes, that's exactly the case. Who lobbies who, and how does it influence the work that we do? Mr. Smith, thank you very much.
Thank you,
all
sir.
the best in the next endeavour. I know the next 3 months are probably going to be very busy for you.
Yes, thank you very much, sir.
Vincent Smith is senior ANC MP, and he's also the chairperson on the ADA committee that's going to look at political party funding here in South Africa. Now, let's just take a quick roundup of what's happening on social media right now. The hashtags, of course, Eskom always seems to be a hashtag that's doing the rounds. Yesterday, the utility appointed Khalib Kassim as an interim chief financial officer following the suspension of Anoj Singh late yesterday. In the sporting world, South Africa's Proteas were off to a good start, but not good enough as the English put them back on the back foot late in the day at the Oval in London. England versus South Africa, that's the hashtag. Today, of course, play gets underway at 12 o'clock as the test goes into a second day. The rain had the final say there yesterday. Now, 1,000 people, or thousands, took to the streets of Cape Town yesterday to raise awareness and stand in solidarity with Palestinians facing brutality in Israel. Muslims in South Africa demonstrated their support with discussions, signs and flags. The hashtag was Palestine, and there was very little coverage in the mainstream media on these marches. There were marches elsewhere in the country as well. Now, Twitter has got a Friday feeling, it seems, as we head into the weekend. Here is a positive thought. You can't live a positive life with a negative mind. Simple, but right to the point. So, put a smile on your dial and everything will end up berries, as they say. The picture of the day comes from Shafiq Morton, and Shafiq is captioned, hashtag South Africa shows solidarity with Palestine over Israel restrictions of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, you've seen that. This is the crowd protesting in Cape Town. That is our picture of the day. We move on to our comment of the day now. This one comes from Jonathan Meyer. And it says, if the St. John's College allegations are true, Arlo had best pack his bags. Racists have no place teaching South Africa's future leaders. Yep, that should be the long and the short of it. Unfortunately, some say that the school has taken a rather lenient view on the matter. We'll keep an eye on it for you. Let's go to the courts quickly. We'll start in the Western Cape today, where convicted serial child offender Andre Retief is expected to bring an urgent bail application in the High Court there pending his application for leave to appeal his new sentence in the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein. Of course, he needs to apply for bail after the High Court overturned his previous suspended sentence last week. Now, Retief will now serve 8 years behind bars. In 2015, he pleaded guilty to more than 2,000 child sex offences. The Para Regional Court sentenced him to 8 years in prison, suspended for 5 years. The NPA then went on and lodged an appeal saying the sentence was inappropriate. Now, we move to the Northern Cape, where a woman accused of poisoning 3 boys and killing 1 will now reapply for bail. The Kimberley High Court overruled the decision taken by the Mtibistad Magistrates Court, which denied the accused bail. The matter has been referred back to the Mtibistad Magistrates Court for that bail application. Then, in Johannesburg, Karabo Mokwena's alleged killer, Sandile Manchwe, is due to appear in the Johannesburg Magistrates Court this morning. He's, of course, accused of killing his girlfriend and then burning her body in April of this year. It was a sensational story at the time. He's been denied bail. We'll be right all over that story to give you the outcomes a little bit later today. Moving on to tomorrow, of course, on Monday, well, we'll be lighting up the conversation about the legalization of cannabis once again here in South Africa. Now, what's known as the trial of the plant starts in the High Court on Monday when the Dagga couple challenges 7 government departments with regards to the legalization framework of marijuana, cannabis, Dagga here in South Africa. We're going to take a short commercial break. We'll be back with you shortly.
Hypertension is the condition where the blood pressure, the pressure in the blood vessels, it goes up.
We often come out at the top of the ladder having the worst numbers. And I think that's because we almost have what I can call a perfect storm of high blood pressure risk factors.
If you are diagnosed with hypertension, you just have to continue taking the medication for the rest of the life.
Because we try and reintegrate them and we try and retrain their abilities to be part of social society.
We do a lot of work trying to educate people, trying to encourage and motivate people to lead a healthy lifestyle. So what a healthy lifestyle means from a blood pressure point of view is obviously the more active you are, and the better your heart is, the more fit your heart is, and the better condition your blood vessels are.
Catch Health Talk every Saturday from 9 to 10 with Dr. Sillo Mutawu.
Remaining with our theme today, a non-profit organization, Right to Know, believes that a legal framework is the answer to promoting transparency in the private funding of political parties. Right to Know is among organizations that have made submissions to the recently established Parliament's Ad Hoc Committee on Political Funding. In its submissions, the organization has emphasized on the importance of public funding in ensuring a vibrant multi-party democracy. Now, to further discuss the Right to Know's proposals, we are joined from our parliamentary studios by Murray Hunter from Right to Know. He's a spokesperson there. Murray, a very good morning to you and welcome.
Thank you, Elvis. It's always a pleasure to be on the SABC.
Now, you've been calling for the regulation of private funding since 2014, if I go back that far. How important is it, not just for voters, but for all South Africans to know where their political funding come from?
I think it's very important what you just said, because we must remember that not all citizens vote, but all citizens still have the right to know who's shaping our politics. You know, the Right to Know is a relatively new organization, but this has been an issue that we've had at our heart really, you know, since very early on. It's important because, let's face it, money and politics have a very close relationship everywhere in the world. But here in South Africa, that relationship is unfortunately cloaked in secrecy. And we know that there are many examples of some of the biggest corruption scandals in our sort of post-94 history there's been an element of donations made to political parties in order in order to get favors. And so there's that element that we need to expose. But the other thing is that there are many donations that don't necessarily fall under the legal definition of corruption, but they are a form of influence. And it means that for ordinary South Africans who are casting a vote every 5 years, their vote is getting diluted because there are donors out there who are making large 100,000 rand, million rand donations to a political party and getting more influence than the influence of that one vote. So what we see is that this influx of money is actually diluting the democratic process. And it's diluting the power of ordinary voters who can't afford to make those big donations. This is one of the reasons that we think we need to shine a light on this relationship and why we really do welcome the steps that have been taken by Parliament to actually finally enact this legislation. It's unfortunately been quite a delayed process. It's one of the forgotten elements of creating a constitutional democracy that we've started since the 1990s. Well,
You just had the ad hoc chairperson there that says that by the 30th of November, there will be a proposal on the table. Are you elated by that prospect?
We've really welcomed the steps that Honourable Smith has taken and his committee. This is unfortunately, as I said, something that Parliament has been looking at and then sort of ignoring, frankly, for the last 20 years, since about 1997 is the first step. And there have been a number of steps taken by outside organizations, by citizens groups, even by some members of the political parties to begin to start that reform process. And, we're late in the day now, but we certainly think that better late than never. And so by November, we'd really like to see a comprehensive proposal, and we'd like to see the parties falling behind that.
Now, you've made your proposal as well, and one of your key proposals is that there should be a legal framework for political party funding. Firstly, what do you mean by that, and how will that assist the process of transparency?
Sure. So I think what we're talking about is the need for a specific law that says political parties receive money both from public sources, from the IEC, and from private sources, from individual members of the public, or they might be companies or wealthy individuals. And the truth is that the political system needs that money in order to actually bring party democracy down to the grassroots. But the problem is that the only transparency currently is around that small pot of public funds. The larger pot of private funds is unregulated. So we want to see a law that firstly states what kind of transparency there will be around that private funding. Will there be regular annual reports, financial reports that the public can look at? Second, who's giving the money, how much? And we should also explore whether certain money should be disallowed. For instance, can foreign governments make donations to political parties? We would argue no, they shouldn't. Can companies that are doing business with the government make donations to political parties? Again, we think that they shouldn't. So we're not only talking about transparency, but also measures put in place to try to cut down on the risk that people are giving donations in order to get tenders and other sorts of favors.
Foreign funders, why are you against foreign funders? Because that could swell the coffers of any political party or perhaps even an NGO like yourselves.
Well, I mean, firstly, let's talk about NGOs for a second and civil society organizations. I think that we should state that at the moment there is already disclosure. So it's a bit of a red herring because, in fact, you can download our financial reports and all of our allied organizations off of our websites. And so we want to see the same sort of transparency from the parties. I think it would be very concerning if we are voting for members of parliament who go to represent the people of South Africa and then discover that they are receiving donations from governments in other countries. What does that mean about our national sovereignty? What does it mean about the independence of our parliament to govern our society if there are strings leading back to other countries?
Are you then suggesting that these foreign funders could perhaps interfere and have undue influence on political parties and even on NGOs if they are funded by foreign nationals?
at the very least, there's an independence problem. And I think there's a perception of an independence problem. And that's why we need to deal with that in some way. And we're not prescriptive to the parliamentary process. We think that this is a conversation that really should have started years ago, but it's starting now. And it must happen in Parliament, and there must be an open and public discussion about it.
How important, and I think we talked about this, but how important is the disclosure of private funders, not just for political parties, but NGOs like yourselves?
Well, I think it is important. I mean, we think that transparency is the way to go, which is why most civil society organizations proactively disclose their funders so that that information is available to the public. When it comes to political parties, if we look at the political problems that we're grappling with as a society now, for instance, with links between the Gupta family and certain political parties and political operators, or the links between certain businesses and political parties, those links should be made public. And in order to do that, we need to see the financial records. And that is not something that should happen through a court process. It's not something that people should have to fight for. It's something that you should be able to access off of their website proactively. These should be reports that are tabled before Parliament, so that parties are really coming clean to the public to say, we're asking for your vote, and in exchange for that vote, we're giving you transparency.
Now, you did indicate that your financials are available, your funding is available, but what about other NGOs in the country, who some are suggesting has got an agenda?
I can't speak for those accusations. I would say that it's really the norm to see that proactive disclosure from civil society. It's a standard that we hold ourselves to, and I think that's an important way of modeling the sort of society and the sort of accountability that we want to see.
Political parties also complaining that they're not getting enough money from the IEC. It's insufficient. So funding is crucial for political parties and even NGOs. What then next in terms of your proposal and other proposals until November, when we first we'll see the light of day of a proposal on the table?
So, I mean, in terms of IEC funding, we believe that the funding should be increased. But we believe that funding, the public funding of political parties, shouldn't be increased until we see the regulations on the table for private funding. Until we have that transparency, we can't talk about more public funding. But it's important to also realize that when it comes to public funding, we believe that the public funding of political parties should really try to foster a multi-party democracy. So, for instance, if someone tomorrow decides that they want to start a new political party to campaign for the 2019 elections, we want to make sure that they aren't locked out of that process because they can't access those public fundings. We do want funding that does help the little folks along, the smaller players along, because having them at the table is actually quite important to ensuring that our democracy is operating in a healthy way.
Maria, thank you so much for your time and joining us in our Cape Town Parliamentary Studios.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
That was from our parliamentary studios, Murray Hunter from the Right to Know campaign. He's the spokesperson there. So we're asking you that poll, of course, the question on your poll, and we want to find out from you, should all political party and NGO funding be disclosed? It's a wider net, isn't it? So far, 147 votes in, 18% are saying no. They shouldn't disclose their funding. And I'm sure that could be some of the political parties in there. But the rest of you are saying they should disclose. So let's take a look at what you are telling us on the Twitter handle at SABC Newsroom, as well as on the Facebook page. We'll read those comments in a short while, but we'll take a break. And when we come back, Eben will take that discussion further with Ibrahim Fakir.
Rights and recourse tackles constitutional issues.
When South Africa became a constitutional democracy, we had a fairly sound legal system in place requiring the Constitution to guide the direction in which it must go and the way in which it must be refashioned.
The Justice Ministry, the custodian of human rights.
We actually have a plan to
come up with a comprehensive review of our human rights instrument.
Advocates dealing with evidence.
Sometimes you have to use a crook to catch a crook. So we expected that their credibility would really be taken to task. You try and consult your witnesses and prepare them as best as you can.
Hashtag Rights with Dumila Matez on legal issues every Sunday at 2 o'clock Central African Time.
Welcome back. You're at Newsroom here on SABC News. If I can just pull myself towards myself. Now, in important discussion today, ordinary South Africans will have a say on how political parties are funded. As from next week, they will have a say on how their political party should account for the funds received from the public purse. The Special Parliamentary Committee established to inquire into and make recommendations on funding of these parties will, as from next week, hear the first oral submissions. Vincent Smith of the ANC has been elected the chairperson of the ADA committee. He says the exercise will try to ensure the strengthening of accountability, transparency and the protection and enhancement of South Africa's democracy. To unpack this, well, no one better or more qualified than Ibrahim Fakir, the Director of Programs at the Awal Socioeconomic Research Institute. A very good morning to you, Ibrahim.
Hi, Evan. Thanks for having me.
This is a very important discussion that South Africa needs to have and kind of having. The ADA committee process that gets underway next week, how do you view it and how do you think, well, what would be ideal, if we can call it that?
Even the timing for me is curious, and I don't want to be too much of a naysayer, but we need to go a little bit into the history of this matter. There were two fundamental court cases, not in magistrates' courts, right up at the apex court, at the Constitutional Court, as far back as the turn of the century, in 2000, the then Institute for Democracy in South Africa brought a court case in the Constitutional Court to try and have political parties disclose their funding. 3 years ago, for the second time, an organization called My Vote Counts tried to do a very similar thing. There were quite stringent arguments made primarily by all the political parties, but especially by the ANC, for why simple disclosure of private sources of political funding is in fact a bad thing. And of course the public was in massive outcry saying you guys don't want transparency, but in fact the arguments were seductively good. They were quite substantive and they are still relevant. Why there's a sudden sea change in the attitude of the ANC to want suddenly disclosure and transparency of private sources of funding is a little bit curious to me after 23 years of serious lobbying that this should happen. I think this is about trying to stymie and firstly fight the sort of war chests which are built up inside the ANC to fight factional battles, and secondly it's for the ANC to try and expose and limit the amount of money which opposition parties are receiving. Now why is this the case? Because once you start disclosing where you are receiving money from and you the party in government, if you are seen as a corporate to be giving money to other political parties, there could well be a punishment that you won't get government contracts or you won't get work, firstly. Secondly, because of that fear, it starts to dry up the amount of money which becomes available in the political system. And thirdly, you know, once you simply have simple disclosure, everyone knows everything, and the disincentives and the fear of punishment is real, it can do two things. Other than drying up money in the political system, it starts to drive this funding underground because you will start getting the money from nefarious sources, secondly. And thirdly, what it will do is that it will start creating all kinds of incentives to form shadow NGOs as conduits to funnel the money. It will start attracting donations in kind. So I start paying for your things rather than showing that I'm actually giving you a donation. So there are actually significant downsides to simple transparency. Should we have regulation? Yeah, we should have some form of regulation, but we need to be extremely prudent about the kind of regulation. To me, it's very suspicious that suddenly there's a massive clamor after 20 years of arguing against it for now suddenly wanting it.
We've seen R1 billion being spent by one political party in the previous election, which is unheard of. Should there be a way to level the playing fields? Is there maybe a cap that we should look at?
Well, precisely. That's some of the proposals made by some people, and some of the academic literature talks about prudent ways of providing caps on expenses, particularly for election campaigns. But there are ways around that too.
Yeah.
And suddenly in-kind donations. So I don't show that I'm spending money, but I receive donations from people who will pay for my tents, pay for venue, cater my events, provide goods and services, provide transportation, etc. So you start getting in-kind donations for these things. But I mean, it is more prudent to say it doesn't really matter. Political parties do have serious work that they need to do. They need to run offices, they need to develop policy, they need to pay for research, they need to pay for advisors, they need to do community outreach, they need to do public relations and advertising. All of those things cost money. Now, if you dry up the money in the system, you're actually disincentivizing the ability of parties to conduct outreach. So caps are one thing, increasing public funding is another. But if you increase public funding, then you've got to change the current formula, because the current formula benefits in a proportionate sense only the big players. New entrants, smaller parties, they are significantly disadvantaged. But also you can't just increase public funding in the face of such serious socio-economic woe.
Yeah, one of the things also, our political parties spend a lot of time in the courts, and that's probably drains the budgets the most. But let's
well, if they wouldn't do anything wrong, they wouldn't find themselves in court.
That's true. Talk to me quickly about the threat of foreign capital inflows, and of course we hear the constant rhetoric around regime change agendas and these kinds of things. How does it tie into this conversation?
Well, I mean, look, the regime change sort of platitude is a bit of a hoax. You know, South African elections are very credible, fairly legitimate, the outcome, and they're generally free and fair. Our voters' role is pretty solid. It is very difficult to play around with the system. So this idea that you might lose power because others are going to vote and influence the political process is a red herring. Only South Africans vote in South African elections. No one has argued for regime change on an extra procedural, extrajudicial, unparliamentary or non-process driven way. So all the instances when people said the president must go, for example, have not said that he must go by the pressure on the streets. The pressure on the streets are saying invoke Section 89 of the Constitution. Go through the courts and ask for an impeachment, ask for his voluntary resignation, ask for the ANC to make a decision to remove their president. These are all procedural and legitimate. There's nothing wrong with that. Where there is a fear is that outside donors might be influencing policy agendas. But that's a reality everywhere. Democracy is about facilitating influence and participation. Why should companies and firms not have the right, like other citizens, to play a part in the political process? You know, the question about regulation, Eben, is that every time you create a regulation, you will open up a loophole in another part of the governance system. There's a point at which regulation cannot serve you well, and ethics, honesty, integrity, and the values that you inculcate in your political parties and your political culture are more important than the actual system of regulation.
Talk quickly to me about the NGO fraternity. Of course, fingers are always pointed at the NGO fraternity, not just in South Africa. We see it in Zimbabwe. NGOs are being kicked out and the like. The work that they do is important within the democratic space, isn't it?
Well, it makes for vibrant society. It makes for vibrant civic culture. It makes for vibrant democracy because they contribute to democracy and to public debate. But they also provide much needed vital social services in instances where governments aren't able to do so. The thing is, NGOs and civil society organizations generally fairly well regulated through, and in South Africa's case, through the Department of Social Development and Social Welfare. So there is an existing regulatory framework, and it's incumbent. NGOs are regulated to the extent that their donations have to be made public. They're made public in annual reports, they're made public on their websites. So these are legislative requirements. I mean, it's a red herring. Everyone knows where they get their money from and the kind of activities that they conduct. But let's be clear. NGOs and civil society organizations are actors in a democracy exercising influence. They do not exercise public power that political parties do. It's a different beast that you're talking about. Also, to create similarities between them is often used by politicians because they want to create the hype around transparency. Suddenly, after 23 years, we want transparency and accountability, when good arguments were made for this a very long time ago.
conclusion, your hopes for the process that Vincent Smith is now embarking on?
I hope it would be prudent. I hope that it will stick to the kind of liberal framework of politics that our constitution envisages. I hope that the regulation that they approach will enhance public funding of political parties, will change the formula to make it a little more equitable. No one is saying proportionality must be thrown out the window. It's an important principle. But I think they should be very prudent about what they do with private funding. One should be careful about not wanting to drive these things underground, not to over-regulate to the extent that it's a disincentive for donors to put money in the political system, because we require it. And let's not forget that companies and firms are not always bad people. They create jobs, they contribute to growth, they have a right to participate in the political process.
They have the right to be good citizens. Thank
Absolutely.
you very much. Ibrahim Fakir is the Director of Programs at the OWL Socioeconomic Research Institute, coming in today to give us his views on, well, political funding processes that's about to get underway here in South Africa. Thanks again for coming in today, Ibrahim. Now, let's take a quick look at the newspapers from around the world. Keep tweeting us, keep telling us what you think. What do you think of driving funding underground if it's transparent? Anyhow, we'll go to Scotland quickly. The Herald reports there that Whitehall's intransigence and incompetence over Brexit are the only barriers preventing Scotland having the immigration policy it needs. The Scottish National Party has insisted, as UK Minister Robin Walker sought to give reassurance that Scottish interests would be heard loud and clear in the EU exit process. Then, across the pond, the Miami Herald says 3 Republicans joined with all Democrats to reject the amendment which would have repealed mandates that most individuals get health insurance and large companies provided to their employees. Finally, in China, the South China Morning Post reports that Hong Kong's largest provider of international education has confirmed that it has secured Education Bureau approval to raise between 5.4 and 27.5% of its 17 schools in the next academic year, prompting one parent to say she feels helpless in the face of the increases. Sounds familiar? Well, we've got Kendall who's just jumped into the studio. Yeah, Kendall is saying that the Lions are going to cause the upset of the year against the Hurricanes tomorrow. Is that true?
I certainly hope so. Unfortunately, why is my picture behind there, like in front of the Hurricanes? Look, we're all hoping so. We're all hoping that the Lions can actually do it, because they finally got themselves into a position where if they do get into the final, they'll host the final. Yeah. Which would have made a difference possibly last year. They would not have had to travel all the way to Wellington and get beaten by the Hurricanes. They're going to be playing tomorrow, 2:30 p.m., around about 3 o'clock kickoff. We're hoping that the Lions can do it.
2:30 in the afternoon on the half-veld can be quite hot at altitude. It'll be a fast-paced game. That should suit the Lions. But the Hurricanes love a pace on the ball as well, huh?
You know what? The Hurricanes, New Zealand teams have shown it year in, year out. You give them conditions, they'll just match the conditions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kendall. Yes, don't miss that one. 2:30 tomorrow, here in Johannesburg. The Lions, that's South Africa's best side. They'll be up against, of course, the Hurricanes. The defending champions. Kendall will be with me for the next hour for all the news and sport. Don't miss it.
What guides us? What leads us forward? Is it leaders on a soapbox, spouting rhetoric for the crowd? Is it the actions of our people? Or the voices of our citizens? Your country is guided by the voices of its people. And your broadcaster is dependent on your voice to guide it. Get your copy of the SABC's editorial policy and have your say.
President Jacob Zuma says that the country's security agencies will seek new and more effective ways to fight crime.
Crime, as you would appreciate, depends on the circumstances. This narrative that South Africans are xenophobic, we don't necessarily agree with it.
This group of Bangladeshi shop owners ooze frustration. They've lost everything.
I'm like totally destroyed. I can't see away what I'll do, where I'll go.
Rescue workers are still searching for the body of a 5-year-old boy who fell into an old mine shaft near Boksburg in Ekurhuleni.
Tensions remain high, with thousands of community members refusing to clear the scene until the boy is found.
Welcome back. It's top of the hour, 10 a.m. Central African time. Another beautiful day in Africa, Kenny.
Oh, that it is, and even better, it's a Friday morning.
Oh, yes, we love a Friday. We love a Friday. Heading into the weekend, hope that you got your plans in order. Of course, we're wrapping up the week by talking about a very weighty issue. Yes, it's around political party funding. Of course, this process gets underway. You can make your oral submissions to Parliament. But we're running a poll, Kendall. We're running a poll and see what people are thinking with regards to full disclosure when we talk about political party funding and NGO funding, mind you, for that matter. But as we've heard from our experts, that there is some measure of disclosure with regards to the NGO fraternity. Of course, some say that it's not enough.
Absolutely, and very interesting that all of our viewers, 82% of the 160 votes that have come in, say yes, absolutely, it should be disclosed. All political and NGO funding should be disclosed, whereas 18% say no. Let's see what's being said about this. Very interesting.
Onuka tells us, yes, transparency is the key word. You better account, disclose. This is the being of genuine leadership, I think is what Anuka is telling us.
Why would you not want to have disclosure in a democracy? Thomas Holiak says, yes, it should be disclosed because corruption will not stop unless we ask questions. Questions need answers. Big bank accounts, same thing.
There we go. We're also running, of course, a different question today, because the one thing that's not going out of fashion in South Africa is racism and incidents of racism, it seems. Now, this teacher has caused quite a stir, and the school is coming to fire for not handling him tough enough.
Yes, St. John's College and their response to the derogatory remarks made to black and Indian students by one of their teachers has actually not gone down very well on social media.
Yeah, the quote was a shocker. You disappointed the blacks by getting a good mark, is what this teacher said. Mystic Man tells us, geez, not St. John's College with such a good record during apartheid era for accepting blacks.
Two sides to every coin, Mystic Man. Japta Koza says the way our black leaders verbal abuse and humiliate each other in public has given whites the impression that we can tolerate humiliation.
Wow, interesting views. Keep tweeting us on this one, because these are the things that South Africans are talking about in social media and mainstream right now. We're asking you the sports question. The Lions, yes, they are the last team outside New Zealand standing, and a lot of people are backing them.
Absolutely, and we want to find out from you. They play tomorrow afternoon in the semi-final against the defending champions, the Hurricanes. Will the Lions overcome the defending champions tomorrow at Ellis Park?
Oh, Malik Kingdom tweets us, he says, no, the Lions will unfortunately come short again. The Hurricanes are very skillful ball players and keep the ball in hand to attack relentlessly. But so does the Lions. You never know. Maybe they run out of puff on the high veld.
Yeah, we hope so. Katlego comes in and says, it's going to be a tough one, but the Lions are much stronger. And Orlando Pirates will beat Kaizer Chiefs because they're making noise here and talking too much.
Katlejo, you are a man of high intelligence, man of rare intelligence who knows football. Yes, these chieftains, they must fall one time. Anyhow, it's Friday. Let's get into our 10 o'clock headlines. Eskom appoints Caleb Kassim as an interim chief financial officer following the suspension of Anoj Singh. ANC Treasurer General William Kize calls on ANC members implicated in the Gupta leaks to clear their names. Karabo Mokwena's alleged killer, Sandile Mantre, is due to appear in the Johannesburg Magistrates Court shortly. Those are your top stories. Let's go over to Kendall for sport.
Evan, thank you very much. Quite a lot happening in the world of sports. In fact, let's start off with what we've got for you in the headlines. Good morning to you.
Oh, that's a beauty. Oh, and what a grab. What a grab that is.
At 171 for 4 at Stumps, it's even Stevens at the Oval in London as Vernon Philander rocks the English, taking 2 wickets after day 1, and Alistair Cook puts in a gutsy performance to steady the English ship.
Century. Moves on to 53 now, Alistair Cook.
So again, we just have to, enjoy it, embrace it, and go out and just give you all.
The Lions will seek to avenge last year's finals defeat to the Hurricanes when they meet in the semi-final tomorrow.
It's very important to see how far we have prepared ahead of the season. So we're looking forward to it.
And it's all systems go as Kaizer Chiefs and the London Pirates prepare to do battle in the Carling Champions Cup at the FNB Stadium on Saturday.
We just have to work hard, because the one who works hard on the day is the one that will take the cup.
It remains to be seen who's going to be triumphant come the end of the afternoon, both in the rugby as well as in the football. All this and more a little later. For now, do stay with Evan as he's got the news.
Yeah, thanks, Kendall. Our top story right now. Eskom has appointed Caleb Kasim as interim chief financial officer following the suspension of Anoj Singh. The power utility says Singh had been placed on special leave pending an investigation into his conduct. It's reported that Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba was forced to intervene after the Development Bank of South Africa threatened to retract a 15 billion rand loan if no action was taken against Singh. He's emerged as a significant party privy to the multi-million rand alleged irregular payment to the Gupta-linked company Trillion. Meanwhile, ANC Treasurer General Willem Kiese has challenged the governing party's leaders who are implicated in the Gupta League saga to clear their names. He was speaking at the O.R. Tambo Memorial Lecture in Katlehong, east of Johannesburg, last night.
Those whose names are being raised in these emails, we expect that they will go up, they'll step forward to clear their names and ensure that they make themselves available in that particular commission of inquiry so that we know what the truth is.
Case of Sandile Mantre, who allegedly killed his girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, Karabo Mokoena, will resume in the Johannesburg Magistrates Court shortly. He is charged with killing the 22-year-old part-time student as well as defeating the ends of justice. Mokwena's burnt body was found in a veld in Lyndhurst in Johannesburg in April after she was reported missing. Mantre claimed to have found her dead, and for fear that he may be blamed for the killing, he decided to dispose of her body. The state believes Mantre may have killed Mokoena because they were tied together in a blood ritual. During an alleged confession, Mantre apparently claimed that after they broke off their relationship, his business began to fail. Transport Minister Joe Maswanganyi says Uber taxi operators and meter taxi drivers have now agreed to a ceasefire. Maswanganyi addressed the media after a marathon meeting with operators in Midrand. The meeting follows a series of violent clashes between the two groups of taxi operators here in South Africa.
Meter taxi drivers not backing down. Their message loud and clear. They blame the app hailing service of stealing their livelihoods and want it stopped.
They simply have to shut down the application because there's no law here in South Africa in the transport that has actually regulated the application.
But Maswanganyi says those regulations will now be tightened.
There are those who are operating without licenses. And we have made it clear that that is not going to be tolerated. And the police are going to enforce the law.
Violence flared up in recent weeks as clashes between the two operators intensified. Both Uber and meter taxi vehicles have been stoned, burnt, and drivers assaulted. But there's hope.
All parties coming out of this meeting denounce violence. That's the understanding that I had. And they will allow everybody who have an operating license to operate unhindered.
Police will be deployed at identified hotspots to monitor the situation. SABC News, Midrand.
Now, a trajectory specialist is expected to testify when the second inquest into the death of Ahmed Timol continues in the Pretoria High Court in a short while. He will represent his findings on whether Timol jumped or was thrown from the infamous John Fall Square Police Headquarters building in Johannesburg 46 years ago now. Yesterday, private investigator Frank Dutton told the inquest that the police had covered up Timol's death.
Unsettling for these reasons.
People did was criminal.
From lying under oath to being a law unto themselves.
This was called the helicopter method.
46 years on,
on a stick.
their methods of systematic physical torture recounted through a book.
Humiliations, being forced to undress, electric shocks to the genitals, being bitten extraordinarily by dogs.
General policing duties.
Private investigator Frank Dutton also roped in. He's been investigating police cover-ups since 1985.
If Mr. Timol had in fact committed suicide, as was alleged, they could have had an impartial and open investigation to prove that.
But there was none, suggesting a cover-up by the initial investigator.
He made a report to the Report newspaper that he believed that Timol had committed suicide, and this was right at the beginning of the investigation.
Dutton is convinced police conduct at the scene was to ensure that the anti-apartheid activist did not survive the fall.
By moving him, the crime scene investigation couldn't take place, couldn't occur.
The court heard that security police implicated admitted having lied to the Truth Commission. The inquest continues. SABC News, Johannesburg.
Earlier this year, senior ANC MP Vincent Smith chaired the ad hoc committee which investigated the fitness of the SABC board to hold office. He says he is more than convinced that the SABC is far better now than when they were starting their inquest.
Hope was that by the time we finished our exercise, the SABC must be a better place than when it was when we started. And I'm more than convinced that the SABC is far better than when it was when we started. And there's a long road to go, but I'm confident that those that are there now will get us to the desired destination.
Now, in a surprise move, ZANU-PF Women's League President Grace Mugabe has challenged President Robert Mugabe to name the person who will take over from him. She was speaking at a ZANU-PF Women's League meeting in Harare yesterday.
ZANU-PF Women's League. Among those attending the meeting, party leader Robert Mugabe. ZANU-PF has nominated President Mugabe as a sole candidate for presidential elections next year. But the party has in recent times experienced division as some jostle for power. Grace Mugabe has challenged her husband to name his successor, saying this has been the trend in other countries. Using the biblical story of King Solomon, she said her husband had the right to be involved.
The president says, no, I don't want to impose any candidate. But I've always argued with him that you have the role, you have the right to be part of that process. Kuti ndiani achatora chigaro mabva president. Because we respect him. Saka, his word will be final. Mark my words, his word will be final.
I ask him right now in front of all of you that others in other countries have done the same. Mandela left Mbeki. Others pronounce in their countries. You must not be afraid. Tell us the horse you want us to ride with.
President Robert Mugabe turned 93 this year. He has recently made a few trips to Singapore for medical treatment, but he has not shown any sign of slowing down.
One of the two vice presidents and secretary shall be a woman. In the same spirit, the women are calling for the realignment of the ZANU-PF constitution to the national constitution.
Why shouldn't we look at our constitution? The constitution is made to serve the people, not the people to serve a constitution. Other countries have more than two. Why can't we have 3 deputies and correct this position that way?
President Mugabe is expected to continue with his election campaign. On Friday, he will address a rally at his home village, while the opposition coalition will hold a rally in Harare. Sophie Mkwena, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Back home, Gauteng's Education MEC Panyaza Lesufi will meet the management of St. John's College in Johannesburg this morning to find out why a teacher found guilty of misconduct is not fired. The school gave the geography teacher a final written warning after he was found guilty of racism at a disciplinary hearing there. He had made derogatory remarks to black and Indian learners. One of the comments he allegedly made to a black learner who had passed well in a test was, and this is a quote, "You disappointed the blacks by getting a good mark." Lesufi says nothing below an expulsion will be acceptable in this case. Of course, we've been running a question with regards to this emotive story here in South Africa. It's caused a lot of unhappiness on social media, with people calling for the dismissal immediately of the teacher in question. But there are a couple of tweets that you guys are sending us. Let's have a look at what you say. Jafta Causa tells us, the way our black leaders verbal abuse and humiliate each other in public has given whites the impression that we can tolerate humiliation. Luetu says, the problem is we forgave an apology we never received from the white community. Racism is still on the high here in South Africa. Keep tweeting us. We're going to take a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk party political funding with the Council for the Advancement of the Constitution here in South Africa. Don't miss that one.
Hello and a warm welcome to PM News, and we're broadcasting live from Johannesburg.
4 decades later, the family is still seeking closure.
We need the truth, and the truth must be told.
Children often go undiagnosed because they are hidden away. About 1 million people in South Africa live with autism.
Creative recycling at play.
Mosaic has been around forever. I just had to find a new, fresh way to put, and a new spin to put on it. So I decided, why not recycled cans?
Stay tuned to PM News for all your news updates every Saturday and Sunday from 1500 hours.
Hello again, everybody. Let's go back to our theme today. Next week, Parliament's ad hoc committee on the regulation of party political funding in South Africa will be hearing oral submissions from all sectors and stakeholders. Political parties and civil society have been making written submissions until this past Monday. There's been widespread concern that private financing of political parties must be regulated and that there needs to be more transparency concerning their financing. Now, senior ANC MP Vincent Smith has been elected the chairperson of the ad hoc committee on the funding of political parties. A little bit earlier, I spoke to him and I asked him about the urgency of this matter.
It is urgent because as we speak, political parties only account for money that they receive from the fiscus. And that is minuscule compared to the amount of money they use generally for campaigning and their operations. Vast majority of the money that political parties receive is not accounted for. Public doesn't know where it comes from, and they don't know what is it that that money is buying in terms of influencing policy.
Now, strict control and a cap on political party spending. Is that the answer to the country's rampant corruption? Now, this is according to the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. It's one of the proposals KSAC is making to Parliament's ad hoc committee on party political funding. KSAC says the regulation of private political party funding will help fill what it says is a gap in accountability and transparency in the country's governance. To talk to us about KSAC's submission on this issue, we are joined from Parliament by KSAC's Lawson Naidoo. A very good morning to you, Lawson. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Eben. Thank you very much.
Let's start with the proposed cap quickly, because I'm very interested in how you guys view the stricter control and a cap on political party spending.
Well, thanks. Eben, I think let me start by saying that this is a matter that is indeed urgent, as Vincent Smith has said, but it's a matter that has been urgent for over 20 years now. This has been a serious flaw in our political system for a long time now, and we welcome the fact that Parliament is finally dealing with the issue of the regulation of the private funding of political parties. As we know, the public funding is a matter that has been in the public domain, and it's an issue that we can discuss. Amongst the proposals and recommendations that we've made to the ad hoc committee is that there should be a cap on the amount that a single donor can donate or provide to a single political party. This is to prevent undue influence by any single donor or rich person over the policy and the behavior of a political party. And it's a mechanism in order to preserve the integrity of the political system, to preserve the integrity of political parties themselves. So it's one of a range of guidelines that we believe need to be considered. We haven't, for example, given a specific rand amount as to what that cap ought to be. That's something that we believe that the ad hoc committee should apply its mind to, and it would require the consent and agreement of all political parties to come up with a figure that is reasonable, that makes sense to all of them. Because ultimately, I think, as Ibrahim Fakir said earlier, the over-regulation of this of the issue of party political funding can only could potentially have negative implications if that funding is driven further underground. So we need to provide a regulatory framework that political parties can buy into, that the electorate feels confident about, and that it enhances the role of political parties and our respect for them.
You touched on that, on moving or illicit financial flows going underground right now within that framework. That's a legitimate threat, isn't it?
It is indeed, and I think, you know, if political parties are going to behave in that way, when they are caught out and found out, then there need to be serious penalties for the breach of a regulatory framework that is put in place. And that's why I say we need to have the political buy-in from the parties into the framework that is put in place, and that framework has got to make sense to the electorate out there, so that we as South Africans understand exactly who is funding the political parties that we're being asked to vote for, and that when we do cast our votes, we're casting that vote with the full knowledge of where that political party is getting its money from and how that may influence or not influence its political programs.
Are you fearful or concerned that in this guise we could see a kind of rise in foreign capital influence in our political processes?
Well, I think, the reality is that we have to accept that some political parties do receive funding from foreign sources, and those sources are different. They're not all the same. So there could be funding from individuals outside of South Africa, from foreign corporates, from political parties in other parts of the world, and there are relationships between political parties across the world, and funding from foreign governments. And we've made a distinction between those, and we said that if, for example, if foreign governments want to fund the political process in South Africa, then they should fund all political parties by funding what we're referring to as a multi-party democracy fund, which will be a standalone independent fund in which those who do not want to donate to a particular political party can donate money into this fund, which will then be distributed on a formula basis, which we also suggest needs to be reconsidered by Parliament. Funding from other foreign donors could be allowed, but there would again need to be a cap on the amount of that funding to a particular political party, once again to prevent undue influence.
Now, some parties have already come out and they've said that putting a cap on these matters will weaken their parties and the work that they're supposed to do, they say. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think this is why this parliamentary process is so important, because those are legitimate concerns from a political party, but they need to be open about it and tell us what their challenges are and how we can then go about crafting a regulatory framework that takes into account those challenges that they confront, but still allows a level of regulation and transparency to be implemented. Because we can't simply say that because political parties face some challenges, that some opposition parties will say that if they had to disclose their donors will stop funding them because they're afraid of repercussions from the governing party. Those are legitimate concerns, but that cannot be an excuse for not regulating this sector. It's high time that we do so. There's significant legal reasons that we need to do so in terms of our own constitution, our commitments in international law, as well as our commitments to good governance and to openness and transparency. So there are sound reasons for doing so, and we need to find ways to accommodate and work within those challenges that the sector faces.
Now, Lawson, in your submissions, you also talk about the regulation of party funding can be a real tool in the fight against corruption. Just give us your view around this idea.
Well, I think in what we've done in our submission is to say that the issue of money in politics has been has been a bane the world over. We've listed in our submission, I think, over a dozen major scandals from around the world, not just in South Africa. We've seen our own scandals here with the Oilgate deal a while ago, the arms deal itself, and various other things, the Gupta leaks at the moment. But we've seen these sorts of scandals across the globe, and the failure or lack of regulation of party political funding has given rise to dirty money flowing into politics, politics being used as a mechanism to launder money and so on. So the regulation of this sector is a critical component of fighting corruption. And we can't say that we're serious about fighting corruption if we're not willing to regulate the sector, to eliminate that spectre of corruption from strengthening its hold in our politics in South Africa. We're seeing it at a local government level in South Africa. We're seeing people being killed across the country at the moment because they're in the wrong faction, and it's got to do with with underhand funding of parties, amongst other issues. So it's a highly important issue that we need to deal with, and we really need to take it seriously.
It seems to permeate through our entire political spectrum. I want to ask you about the issue of accountability and transparency, and whether you expect this to make a dent in the support of some, or even influence support in some ways.
Well, I would hope that it would increase support for political parties by having a regulatory framework in place that people have confidence in. We're hoping that, in particular, other corporates in South Africa, in particular, will find the need to, or find reason to support the political process by donating to this multi-party democracy fund to increase the coffers that would be available for political parties. We accept that political parties need money for their sustenance and to be able to function effectively, their existence is important for the strengthening of democracy in South Africa. And we therefore want to encourage funding of political parties, but funding that is done in a responsible way and that ensures that money is also spent by political parties in a responsible way. So that it's spent on issues of policy development, research, rather than simply paying salaries or increasing the salaries of elected representatives and so on. So, those issues around how money is spent, the fact that parties will need to account for their expenditure are all critical components of this framework that we think needs to be put in place.
What are the risks of political parties being captured, even the state, for that matter?
Well, I think it's a significant risk. I mean, I think we've seen as a result of the recent exposures of the Gupta leaks that parts of the ruling party and certainly certain individuals within the ruling party have been captured by the Guptas and others around them, and we've seen how that has taken hold. And I think this is a warning sign for us that if we fail to deal with this issue, this will continue to happen and will continue to undermine our democracy and continue to undermine procurement processes and allow continued looting of state resources. That's something that we cannot afford in South Africa. We therefore need to regulate, and if it means that we need to increase the public funding of political parties, even within the fiscal constraints that we face, this is an important factor, and that we should not simply say that we can't afford it, because it may actually cost us more if we say we do not do that. But obviously it would need to be done within reason, and it would need to be done on condition that the private funding of political parties is appropriately regulated.
In conclusion, let's move into the NGO space. You, of course, are a major figure in the NGO space in South Africa with KSAC and Save South Africa and the like in the recent past. There's a lot of regulation with regards to funding in the NGO space and all those that have an influence, call it an influence in South African politics. Are you happy that this sector is regulated enough, or do we need more oversight?
Well, I think it's a self-regulated sector to a large extent. There are smaller NGOs that rely on funding from government through the Department of Social Development who are highly regulated. There are many others where there's little regulation, but what has happened is that on their own volition, many civil society organizations and NGOs do indeed disclose the sources of their funding. We disclose who our funders are. And I think if there's if there's a level of prescription that is there that means that we all agree to the same standards, that's something that I think that can enhance the legitimacy of the civil society sector, and I don't think we should see ourselves as being immune from this. And I think we pride ourselves on the fact that we are open and transparent, and we need to prove that. And in so doing, we need to also ensure that regulation does not take away the very funding that these civil society organizations rely upon.
There's a lot of fear-mongering, of course, going on in South Africa's political landscape around things like regime change and foreign capital inflows and these kinds of controls. The NGO sector in South Africa, you're happy that this is not happening in the NGO sector?
Well, absolutely. It may be happening in small pockets, Eben, but there's no evidence that it is happening. We hear lots of claims of a regime change agenda and that civil society organizations are fomenting it at the behest of Western powers, but not an iota of evidence has been brought forward to support that in any way. So it's part of a political narrative that we have to deal with, and that's why I think it's important for civil society sector to be open about its funding, to be open about its decision-making processes, and I think that we are indeed doing that, and we have established our legitimacy within the eyes of the people in South Africa, who ultimately have to make a choice as to whether they, to support the work that we do.
Lawson, fantastic to have you on the show today. Thanks for coming in and giving us your views. Lawson Naidoo is the Executive Director of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, also known as KSAC. Now, that concludes the work that we've been doing on party political funding. Of course, we're running a poll to find out how you think about this, and we're asking this: should all political party funding be disclosed? And we've added in the work that NGOs do and other role players in the political space. If you have influence in the political space, surely you should be transparent. What do you guys say? Overwhelming majority say yes. Yes, you need to be transparent if you want to influence political conversations. 82% say yes. Proudly Koi Koi tweets us and says, it's high time that South African voters must know who really are behind their political parties. Foreign government funding should not be allowed. Well, in South Africa, it is allowed at the moment. One of 8 countries, we heard a little bit earlier, that still allows that kind of thing. Killjoy says to us, yes, but not now. The ANC will bankrupt the funders of the opposition. Anyhow. Onuke says to us, yes, transparency is the key word. You better account, disclose. This is the being of genuine leadership, says Onuke. Yep. Anyhow, let's go over to Kendall now to bring you up to speed with what is happening in the world of sport. He's got some great interviews lined up, I'm told.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I'll tell you what, I'm going to try and go match you tit for tat with some of the great conversations you've had today. I've got Thando Manana of Being a Black Springbok fame in studio with us shortly. But before we get into our chat with him, let's bring you a little bit of what's going on out at the Oval in London, because it was a pretty even day at the office on day 1 of the 3rd cricket test between England and South Africa at that Oval. Intermittent showers in South London caused numerous interruptions in play, but the Proteas took 4 wickets, while England managed to end their day on 171 for 4 after 59 overs rather.
Opener Keaton Jennings' woes continued at the top of the English batting lineup after the home side won the toss and opted to bat. He became seamer Vernon Philander's first victim, departing for a duck, his 6th innings in 8 matches where he didn't get into double figures. Alistair Cook and debutant Tom Wesley shared a 52-run second-wicket partnership to guide their side to an early lunch on 62 for 1 after rain interrupted play. It was the Proteas who drew first blood in the post-lunch session at the Oval. Seamer Chris Morris dismissed Wesley for 25 in the first over after the break. Philander, who was off the field for almost an hour in the morning with an upset tummy, made a breakthrough immediately after being allowed to bowl, removing England captain Joe Root for 29 thanks to a spectacular catch from Quinton de Kock behind the stumps. Cook was the mainstay of the England innings. It took him more than 3 hours to score his 55th Test half-century, but he put himself on the top 10 list of batsmen with the most scores in excess of 50 runs in Tests, with 85 from 143 matches. Kagiso Rabada, who's back in the side after a 1-match suspension, also got into the action before the interval, clean bowling England's second debutant in this match, David Malan, for 1. And England went to tea on 149 for the loss of 4 wickets. The rain returned during the tea break, and the start of the final session was delayed for about an hour. The players managed to get in about half an hour of play, with England adding just 22 runs to their total before the heavens again opened. Play was abandoned for the day soon after, with the English on 171 for 4. Samantha Mari, SABC News.
Right, now over the last few weeks, no less than 2 rugby greats have fallen. Sali Lipper Fredericks and Willie Lebomzankosha passed away in the early to mid-70s, having fought the good fight for inclusivity in rugby. We might have missed a boat with regards to celebrating these great heroes on this show, but we're certainly not going to do that with Thando Manana. Springbok number 708. Thando, thanks very much for coming through and welcome to Newsroom.
Quite privileged and honoured to be on your show, Ken, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thando, before we get too far into it, I think just some stats that might contextualize who you are and where you fit into the bigger picture, because your Springbok debut was on the 8th of November 2000 versus Argentina A in Tucumán.
That's
you were 23 years old, and your last tour match was just 3 weeks later. 28th of November 2000, you did not play a single test. You played 3 midweek matches for the Springboks, and that's it. 0 tests, tour matches 3, total Springbok matches 3, tours, Argentina, Ireland, Wales, England, all in 2000. Position was flank. That speaks volumes about your experience of being a black Springbok.
It speaks volumes to the fact that I was amongst the greatest of the great of South African rugby at the time. If you look at Rassie Erasmus, Andre Vos, you look at Andre Venter, you look at Warren Brosnan, and it tells you that it's never easy to play for a national or represent your national team, but you have to keep on pushing. Unfortunately, along the way, there are obstacles that one has to face, and I faced those obstacles. And many people will wonder why then, like you mentioned now, is unfortunately it's the system. It's a system that maybe doesn't require one to have an opinion. I've always got an opinion, and I feel that if the rugby at the stage in 1992 went for unification, certainly that meant that they have to allow us, and not to be mere branded at the time, or even today, in fact, even yesterday, with people that would make the derogatory comments of still using the Kota name. So it just tells you that we haven't moved anywhere near where we'd like to go. But for me, quite an honor to have played for Junior Springbok at the time and fared very well in the African Nations Cup. But also, I think, as you said, rightfully so, is when my name was announced. And I think it was announced with people that would later go on to win World Cups. Unfortunately, everybody's road or route or journey is not the same. But for me, to have been named and also been on the honours board as a Springbok certainly means a lot of volume and a lot of achievement through persistence.
Phenomenal. The book, what made you write this book?
Well, in 2011, one sort of looked at, not the wrongs, but looked at myself. I have to be honest, and I said, I feel that I'm not motivated at reading other people, but I would like to know, when, as black people, I think the problem in South Africa, maybe in the whole Africa, is, we always undermine our own selves. I'm very comfortable with myself. That is why, or hence the book is called Being Black Springbok. And if you're not comfortable with your skin color, you've got a big problem. You're trying to appease people who don't see anything in you. So you've got to appease yourself. And for me, that's one of the reasons that, I wanted to write the book. I knew I always had a story to tell, but the story that I was going to tell was a life story. Was a life story that I left everything. I left the comfort zone. I left the family. I left everything. I took a bus and I went to Kimberley, where I arrived in Bloemfontein 2 o'clock in the morning. I was only picked up at 10 the next morning. I had to wait 8 hours in a bus station, waiting for an opportunity to continue playing provincial rugby. Little did I know that I was going to the right destination. It just needed a lot of patience.
Because you became the very first African to represent the Griquas.
That's correct.
In its 130-year history.
Yes, it's a long history, and Griquas is predominantly known for the Afrikaner-speaking community, and they pride themselves with being a Griqua. But for me, I had to get in and move in quite quickly. Hence, I write in the book that my secret weapon when I got to Kimberley was I could converse in Afrikaans, I understood the language, I could write it, I could read it, but they never knew that I was able to also add on a third language at the time. So you've got to, along the way, which is in the book, you see how I was managing to close the loopholes that were there, and also know that I've got an ace that is close to my chest.
You did say that your greatest motivation at the Griek was that you could not afford to have a single bad game.
You can't. How do you come back when you're out of the team? It didn't happen to me. I think I had 6 men of the match performances on a trot from a friendly game against a Cheetah side, and that eventually led me winning a Defender of the Series alongside Player of the Series Kennedy Tsimba at the time. So it just tells you of the amount of knowledge that I knew at the back that I have to perform week in, week out. And I did exactly that through the hard work that was obviously always there for any rugby player. I mean, I was not exceptional in a sense, but I worked twice as hard, but I knew that everyone was doing the same.
No, you made a massive impact in your very first year with the Griquas. I mean, shortly after that, you were right there with the Springboks. One thing that stood out at this particular launch, Thando, there are a couple of things. One, reading the book, it felt like a kick in the stomach for me.
Okay.
It felt so real. So many things were coming home to me in terms of the experiences you described from when we were young all the way through to where you are now. And I believe that a lot of people will identify with some of that. But the one thing that did stand out was not a single one of your cohorts from the Springboks was at this particular launch right here in Johannesburg. You've had 2 others, I know, in the Eastern Cape. How does that resonate with you that none of them were there?
Well, I don't think when I had the book launch I was going to have a pen and tick who was there, who wasn't there, obviously.
It was packed.
I do have to say that those that came to attend, I'm very honored and grateful for their attendance. Those are the people that one has to look forward to. Did they have an interest? Well, you've got to go back to 2000, in fact. Was there an interest then? Is there an interest now to make sure that they support also the black players. You'd look at a guy like Ashwin Willems. Did they support him at his book launch? Those that he won the Rugby World Cup, they didn't even go. So it's not about that. I think people have to remain focused on what lies ahead, and that's what I'm doing. Is the book is there for the mothers and fathers. I mean, there's an incident early this morning of a geography teacher. And what about the kids that are playing sport at those schools? You know, what happens to them after they've matriculated and gone out, you know. And they love the sport. I've been to a Craven Wickets and Scythians, and they were there in numbers and droves. And I always question what happens to them after 21 years. They get lost in the system. Maybe it's time for introspection from those parents, you know, to support their kids and be role models themselves in making sure that their kids go all the way and they question relevant you know, questions to the different coaches that are there, not let it to the coach and sort of stand on the bylines. It's important that you, as a parent, you question, because we're going to forever have these problems, these racial problems that are going to be there, and how best to do it is for the involvement of the parent.
You said something when you got in your infamous tour to Buenos Aires and then and so on. During that time when you refused to be initiated, and what you felt was a hollow initiation relative to what you had as a person, as Umxhosa.
Yes.
And you said you felt that the initiation itself, there was no interest in inclusivity, but they wanted you to conform to their norms.
Yeah.
Is it still the way things are across all spheres of life in South African race relations?
I'll tell you, reading John Smith's book, and it gets to a point of the Kontiki, is he fast forwards the time and tells a different Kontiki story. And that Kontiki is a beautiful one, where your wives, your family, when you get the initiation, they're there to watch you get your cap or get your blazer. And then from there, you move on, obviously. They don't go back on how the real one was. That for me is the question, is many people would always want to look at what is happening currently now. Mine was at the time where we were not looked as being equal, we're not considered, in fact. I remember the Kontiki chairman was Jos van der Westhuizen. Alongside was Mark Andrews, on the left was Andre Venter. They never had an interest to find out even my little bit of background. I had to stand on my own. I felt isolated. But you know what, Kendall? In life, you don't regret things that you believe in and you stand for. And I did exactly that. That is why I'm saying people forget. They want to tend to look at what those people write because they sugarcoat what is currently happening or was happening at the time for them to sort of appease them and say that they've had a say. You look at the Kamstalrat. Why as a country have we been furnished with the real happenings of what took place in that disaster going to the World Cup? We had the Gio Cronje, Quentin David saga. Yes. What is happening? Why is everything swept underneath the table? I write in the book about our experience in the same Kamstalrat when I went with the Bulls. I write it as it happened, where we were only able to eat half a banana for a day. And we had tremendous hard work picking up heavy objects.
Called chocolate boxes?
It's chocolate boxes they used to call. Remember, it's military type of act you had to take on. And also, the incident that I write very nicely about is when we were woken up early hours of the morning, in the middle of the night. We had to swim across a river. Now, what strength or mental strength does it give you? Because there's no mental strength. It's just fear across. You don't know if there's crocodiles underneath. You have the scare of drowning. But was those things, did those things ever come and assist us in going forward? Not at all. So we still have a long way to go in terms of identifying who is this rugby for? Is it only for a certain few? And how do we then keep on also allowing people to use us as black people as a scapegoats whenever things are not going well for this country?
Thando Manana, thank you very much for having shared with us. Too little time to cover so much that we need to talk about. But I think this is a book that a lot of people will need to get hold of, and it will educate you. It will show you all the travails and challenges and sometimes the environment that many in South Africa still have to face. Thanks very much to Thando Manana on that book, Being a Black Springbok. Now on to other news. A trajectory specialist is expected to testify when the second inquest into the death of Ahmed Timol continues in the Pretoria High Court in a short while. In fact, we're going to be going there now, where the findings will be presented on whether Timol jumped or was thrown from the infamous John Foster Square.
The window pane was braced with an additional lever that could be locked to prevent the window from closing in windy conditions. In the report that I wrote, I drew the orientation of the window, and with the dimensions of the window being 155 centimeters high, a width of 71 centimeters, and the area that Mr. Timol had to fit through was 44 centimeters. I then also looked at papers on forensics regarding people jumping from buildings and cliffs.
Ms. Moodley, if I can interrupt you just for one moment. Before we move on to the trajectory, given the police version that you have just recounted for us, and given your examination of the physical attributes of room 1026, and the attributes and measurements of the window itself, would you be able to give this court an approximate estimation of how long it might have taken Mr. Timol to move from his seat? And for that purpose, I'd like you to consult Exhibit C8, which has a blown-up photocopied photograph of room 1026. And according to the evidence, Mr. Timol was seated in seat B, and Mr. Rodriguez in seat A. And we know from the evidence of Mr. Rodriguez that he allegedly exited out of the left window, close to where Mr. Rodriguez is standing. Would you have a rough estimation of how long it would have taken Mr. Timol to essentially get onto that window and exit?
My Lord, I can try, but this can be done experimentally as well, which we haven't done yet. But I would like to state that from what I read, Mr. Timol, sitting on chair B, had to get up out of chair B, turn around, run towards the door, and as he ran towards the door, he would have to turn around again, run towards the left table, maneuver around that left table, and run on the left side of the table that he was sitting at. He would then need to basically climb that windowsill, which is approximately 950 millimeters high, climb onto the ledge, and then jump. If I had to add some times to that, I would say to move from B in the direction of the door would probably have taken him 1 second. To move from the door back to the corner of the table, maybe another second. To maneuver around there, another second, so 3 seconds. And to climb up onto the windowsill, about 2 seconds. So that's a total of 5 seconds if he did it efficiently. If he did it and he took his time in doing that, because I believe that he asked to go to the toilet, and that's why he moved in the direction of the door, it would meant that he would have walked towards the door. I believe that to move from B to basically to the door would have taken him about 2 seconds, and then to run the rest of the way, it would have taken him a few more seconds to get to the corner. So it could be between 5 and 8 seconds for him to get onto the ledge of the window. So if he was efficient, about 5. If he basically took his time to move towards the door first and then run back towards the window, about 8 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Moodley. Please proceed with your evidence in relation to the trajectory. I believe you were on page 2 of your report.
Yes. So if you look at figure 1.2, it gives you some basic orientation dimensions of how somebody would jump from a building or a cliff. The important dimensions to remember is the person's center of mass. The center of mass is a very important parameter because most bodies will rotate around the center of mass. The height that the center of mass is above the ground is also important because that will tell us the time it took to fall through that height. The flight distance would be the distance from the point of takeoff to the point of landing in the horizontal plane. The launch angle and the launch velocity is extremely important because that sets up the initial condition. And most people who would intend on jumping would always launch partly vertically and partly horizontally because you're lunging, right? And in my sort of analysis of what a jump would be if somebody's trying to escape, is they would try and jump with full force so they could get away as fast as possible, and the momentum that they had built up in towards running there, combined with the adrenaline, would give them energy to jump at their full force. When we do a trajectory calculation, it's very important for us to determine a few factors. The first factor that we need to understand is how long would it take for a body that's falling to reach the ground? And having known that, based on the initial conditions of the launch, how far would that body land from the initial launch position? The final velocity at the instant of the impact, and the impact forces or the change in moment when the body contacts with the ground. What I basically did thereafter was I looked at the descriptions of what people said in statements at how the late Mr. Ahmed Timol fell. And it was important to take everybody's considerations take everybody's statements into consideration. So Mr. J. Rodriguez's statement stated that Mr. Timol allegedly jumped out of the window from room 1026. His statement had a page missing, which described the entire action. So we couldn't draw more there. All we could assume from that statement was that the person jumped out of the window. Then there was a Mr. J. G. Daisel statement, who basically gave a statement of the body being found on the ground. And his statement stated that the deceased had fallen into some shrubbery on some sandy ground. The deceased body was lying perpendicular to the building with the head pointing towards the building and the legs pointing towards the road. The deceased was lying on his stomach with his face pointing towards slightly to the right. This extract was taken out of the forensic pathologist Dr. S. Naidu's report. Then on Monday, we heard Advocate E.A. Mathis' testimony. Advocate Mathis' recollection of the body falling was as follows. The body was falling horizontally on its side, not head or feet first. The body was falling parallel to the building with the head in the direction of the motorway. That means the head was facing in a westerly direction. Right? The body landed approximately 1.5 meters away from the building in the same direction, parallel to the building it was falling, and the head was still pointing in the direction of the highway or motorway in a westerly direction. On the ground, the late Mr. Timol had one hand extended over his head while the other hand was under his body. When Advocate Mathis looked out the window, he saw a body lying approximately 1.5 meters away from the building in a similar posture as what he saw it falling. He also said he looked up, and when he looked up, he did not see any window open. Reviewing these statements and these testimonies of these people, basically what I then did was looked at each one of those statements. So if you looked at Mr. J.A. Rodriguez and a jumping statement, I took two scenarios with that. One where somebody would jump with maximum sort of energy to try and get away as far as possible, and another scenario where they would just step. So that would be scenario 1 and 2. I then took Mr. J.A. Dasel's version, and I created another 2 scenarios. That would be scenario 3 and 4. So scenario 3 would be basically somebody plot put onto the windowsill in a seating position, and while seated, they are pushed from above the center of gravity, so anywhere above the center of gravity, which is typically around the waist area, so on his shoulders or above, back, shoulders, head, possibly. And then the other scenario, scenario 4, I looked at whereby somebody, or he would climb out leg first and then be pushed by the head and shoulders out the window, so that he would land in the same direction looking at the building. So basically, when he exited in scenario 4, he would be looking into the room with his legs out of the window and basically either pushed or propelled outwards. Scenario 5 and 6 referred to Mathis's testimony, and in that version of Mathis's testimony, he says that the body fell parallel to the face of the building in a horizontal position with the head pointing in the direction of the motorway. And I basically created 2 scenarios whereby I didn't believe a body could fall in that direction if it exited out of that window, because the window opened clockwise with the glass pane, and I will refer to a figure that's later on in this report that basically says that Timol could not have exited the window towards the right because the glass and the window pane would have obstructed him from doing that. So he either exited in that orientation below the window or above the window. So it could bring the roof into play in that. So that's with Mathis's evidence. I basically looked at the scenario of a body being thrown from the roof down parallel to the building or rolled off the parapet wall. I'll go back to how I then, the approach I used to compute the trajectory. In the engineering world, there's different mathematical models, but the 2 common solutions are kinematic solution, which only looks at time, distance, and velocity. And then there's a Lagrangian systems of equations that solves a dynamic system of equations that basically looks at external forces and internal forces. Your external forces would typically be the gravitational force that the Earth exists, or that the Earth exists on our body due to rotation, the aerodynamic force due to the density of the air and the speed that you're traveling through air, and the third force that I looked at was the, let's go back to it, an impulse force that would be generated either internally by somebody using their legs to thrust themselves, using their hands to propel themselves, or somebody pushing or prodding at them. So the external and internal forces there. And what we then do is, all this analogy is based on Newton's laws of motion, right, which basically led to a lot of engineering problems being solved when the apple didn't fall too far from his head. I then researched information on the aerodynamics because the gravity is fairly common and is well known. His mass would not change during his trajectory, it's constant. The gravitational force would be constant because he's not traveling that far. It's 35 meters. So the aerodynamics that I've looked for was basically the aerodynamics of a body in different posture positions, and I'll refer to figure 3.1 for that. The Taylor's University in Malaysia did computational fluid dynamics analysis and solutions around the drag of a body in different postures when it basically falls. So a person who's standing, right, would almost have the highest drag coefficient. A person that is squatting or in a supine position, so supine position means that the airflow, or if you picture somebody flying head first, is supine, where the air flows through the smallest cross-section of the body, which would be his head and shoulder area, has the lowest drag coefficient. The sitting position has an intermediate drag coefficient, and the squatting position also has an intermediate. So I used that report to create and develop the 6 scenarios. Scenario 1, and I'll refer to it in the table 1. Basically, we calculated the height of the building to be roughly 35 meters high from the point of impact to the point where the center of gravity would be on the windowsill. And if you looked at the height of the roof, we then said the roof would be another 3 meters above that point. How did I apply impulse forces? Was I took approximations of his mass and a relative quantity of his mass and applied it to his body for 0.5 seconds in impulse. Because if somebody pushes you, they would push you for a certain distance and release you because they're not holding on to you, right? They're just pushing, the action of pushing. So it's an impulse force. So it means it's applied over a specific period of time. I then looked at, so if we look at scenario 1 where he jumped, right? The height he jumped from was 35 meters. The impulse force that was applied to his body was 48 kilograms for 0.5 seconds. The aerodynamic drag coefficient in a standing position in the horizontal direction was 1. The aerodynamic drag in the vertical direction was 0.25, because when he was falling through the air feet first, I assumed that his body was intact, and it's the smallest cross-sectional area of his body.
Mr. Midley, you're referring to
Table 1.
Table 1.
Yes.
On page 6.
I'm referring to Table 1 on page 6. I then looked at the surface area in the horizontal direction and the surface area in the vertical direction. And from there, I calculated a trajectory, which in section 3.1, it gives you the plot of his trajectory for a scenario where he jumped, we would have jumped. Given that he jumped with almost 75% of his own weight in a 45-degree angle, I computed that he would have landed 13 meters away from the building, provided that he jumped leg first.
And that's a graph on page 7?
That's the graph on page 7, right? And below that graph is the time that it took for him to reach the ground, which was about 3.65 seconds, right?
And Mr. Moodley, in your estimation, 13 meters would probably take him onto the road?
From when we were standing at John Foster Square, I strongly believe that he would have actually cleared the existing fence that's there and probably landed on the road. I did not measure the distance to the road.
Thank you.
I then looked at scenario 2, where I said that Mr. Timol would have just stepped out of the window to just get away from the situation that was in. And again, the height that he fell from that position was 35 meters. His impulse force would be equivalent to somebody stepping, and I said that he would have stepped with about 20 kg force for about 0.5 seconds. His aerodynamic drag would be the same as when he was jumping, and his surface area would be same. And if you looked at figure or section 3.2, scenario 2, you would find that he would have landed 4 meters away from the face of the building, jumping the same distance. And the time that it took is about 2.7 seconds, right? So you can see somebody jumping and stepping out of the window. There's a big difference in how the horizontal flight distance that they would cover. I then looked at the situations of Daisel, which claimed that his body landed with the head in the direction of the building. In scenario 3, I assume that a force was applied above his center of gravity.
Mr. Moody, just to pause for a second and to sum up scenarios 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And neither of those scenarios would fit the police version in terms of distance and positioning of the body on the ground?
I do confer with that. Yes, I would say that. So the distances are beyond what the police versions are claiming, as well as his orientation and direction would be he'd be landing leg first, and his head would probably have fallen forward because he had a horizontal force pushing him forward. So his head would lie in the direction of the road, and his legs would lie in the direction of the building. So in the complete opposite direction of what Daisel found him.
I see. And also in terms of his injuries, you would have expected to have serious feet and leg injuries.
Yes.
Massive fractures, presumably.
I would believe so, because that would be his main point of impact, that region, his legs.
And presumably pelvis as well?
I wouldn't know. I'm not a medical expert to basically make a call on that. But if he landed on his feet, knowing the structure of our body, the forces would then translate up his limbs, so his bones in his limbs, and probably to his pelvis. And if you look at how the pelvis is attached to the torso, it's only connected via the spinal area, and I think that he would have dislocated his spine as well. But not being a medical expert, I wouldn't want to comment.
No, that's fair enough, thank you.
If I may, these scenarios you're painting, did you consider in what direction he was facing shortly before going out of the window?
Yes.
Whether he was pushed from the back, we're talking about pushing now, from the back, or he was facing the person who was pushing him, and whether that would make a difference in terms of the trajectory.
My Lord, that would make a big difference. And I did say that earlier on. In scenario 1 and 2, I assumed that he was jumping away from the person, so he'd be facing in the direction opposite the person, so he was be facing in the direction of the road, not the building. In scenario 3, he was also facing towards the road because he would have been sitting on the window ledge. In scenario 4, I assumed that he was facing the building, so he'd be looking into the window or looking into the room, more like it, and so he'd be pushed or he would have propelled backwards, if that makes sense. Okay. So in scenario 3, he would have propelled forward, face forward, and in scenario 4, he would have propelled backwards with his back, assuming the trajectory. Okay, so
you're on 3.3, right? Scenario 3.
Scenario 3. So scenario 3.3, basically, I assumed that Mr. Timol was placed on the windowsill, in a sitting position, right, and then pushed above his center of gravity. So it could have either been his back, or it could have been his shoulders, or it could have been on his head, right? And that would possibly induce a trajectory that would result in him somersaulting through it, which would probably explain why he landed with his head facing the building. In that particular scenario, I used a pushing force because now the impulse force is no longer his legs, which is the stronger limbs. The pushing force now would be hands, right? And I used an impulse force of 15 kilograms, which is a fairly medium sort of force that you'd use to push with your hands. And I assumed that he was pushed slightly above his center of gravity, his shoulders, pushed at his shoulders. And in that situation there, the height is still the same, 35 meters, and you'd find that he would have landed 3 meters away from the building. His time to fall was 2.8 seconds, the 35 meters. And again, what I did there was I used the aerodynamic coefficients presented between sitting and standing. So I took sort of a medium and I used 0.7 as a parameter to look at approximating his body through a somersault, right? And that resulted in him landing a distance of 3 meters away with a time of 2.8 seconds. If we're happy, I can move on to scenario 4, unless there's questions on that. Okay. In scenario 4, I looked at the scenario whereby his legs would have been out the window and he would have either used his hands or somebody would have pushed his upper torso out the window, so he would fall backwards through the air and he would land exactly like the way Diesel had showed, with his head in the direction of the building and on his stomach. In that particular situation, I used the same pushing force of 15 kgs to be representative with somebody pushing with hands, right? And I assumed the aerodynamic position of him flying horizontally, perpendicular to the building. And I got a distance that he would have landed away from the building at being about 3.1 meters. So what we're trying to get at is that there's not much of horizontal distance and difference between scenarios 3 and 4, the way he landed. If we have any questions on that, I'm willing to take it. Otherwise, I can move on to scenarios 5 and 6.
Mr. Moody, before we move on to 5 and 6, so just to confirm that scenarios 3 and 4 do, in your view, result in Mr. Timol landing in the orientation as described by Mr. Diesel?
Yes.
But in both scenarios 3 and 4, that would, in your opinion, involve a push out of the window?
Yes.
Thank you.
So instead of using legs to propel themselves, hands would have been used to propel his body.
But to be clear, could it potentially be his hands or somebody else's hands in terms of a push?
At this point in stage, I don't believe he would be able to move his hands as much as somebody who had free hands to be able to thrust him. So for 0.5 of a second that I used, it would be a full extension of one's arms, whereas if you looked at somebody sitting on a sill, their hands would have moved probably less than 100 millimeters if they had to release themselves from the windowsill, right? So if somebody pushed him, they would have a full extension, so probably between 0.5 meters and 0.8 meters, which would confer with the impulse force that I applied. But if somebody had to do it themselves, the impulse force would be much lower because the amount of force application would be for over a much shorter distance.
So without the aid of a push, in your view, am I correct in saying that he wouldn't have traveled the horizontal distance of 3 meters, would have likely have come a bit closer to the building?
Much closer to the building. So because his impulse force would have been much lower.
Thank you.
Moving on to scenarios 5 and 6, and that's basically looking at scenarios in line with Advocate Mattis's testimony, where, according to him, he was positioned on either level 4 or 6 of the building, and said that he had good visual sight of the body falling past the window. His description of the body falling past the window was horizontal and parallel to the building. In my opinion, given the way that the window opens, it would be very difficult for an individual to be able to orientate his body, leaving perpendicular to the face of the building, rotate in mid-air in a matter of 3 seconds, and passing halfway through the building in a horizontal position parallel to the building. He would have had to have left the initial condition in that particular position. And that's why I took the liberty of looking at what happens if he was either thrown from the roof or rolled off the roof. And that's the scenarios 5 and 6. So in scenario 5, right, I assumed that 2 people carrying Mr. Timol would swing him on the roof a slight distance behind the parapet wall, because I would say it would be quite dangerous for somebody to stand at the edge and try to swing somebody and throw them. They would stand at least half a meter to a meter behind the edge, and they would release him. The force that I used there, or the impulse force that I took into consideration there, is only 20 kilograms horizontally. And the reason I did that is because those 2 people had to still carry the body, which weighed 60 kilograms, and also generate, so they would carry the body, which weighed 60 kilograms in the vertical direction, and then they would need to generate a horizontal force above that to thrust the body horizontally. Hence, I took 20 kilograms. And I used the orientation and the aerodynamic drag coefficients in line with what Advocate Mattis said about the body being parallel to the building and falling purely horizontally. And in that situation, I've got a distance, a flight distance of about 4.2 meters away from the building. But the height now was 38 meters higher because we're no longer on the 10th floor, we're on the roof of the building. And the trajectory there was roughly 2.85 seconds. I then looked at the same scenario of Mr. Mattis, and I said, what happens if somebody rolled him off the roof of the building? So they would have placed him on the parapet wall and pushed his body. So they would have to firstly overcome friction because his body would be lying flat on the surface, right? So they would literally have to push him against so there'll be a rubbing effect of his body onto the parapet wall, and then a release effect. So the force that actually would have been used to release him would have been very low, because once he left the edge, that force would no longer be applied. So I looked at a force of about 6 kilograms, which is quite a light force, but most of that force would be used, not the 6, but most of the energy or the force that the people who would push him would be used to actually push him over the surface. And when they get him over the surface, only a small force would be needed to propel him. And that situation, I ended up with a distance, a flight distance of 1.2 meters away from the wall, or from the building, and his orientation that he would have basically flew in would have been in line with what Advocate Mattis said. So those 6 scenarios sort of summarizes the different versions of information that we got in terms of how the person had left the building.
I see. If we can just deal with scenarios 5 and 6.
Yes.
From what you're saying, Mr. Mudley, there's some differences between these scenarios and the earlier scenarios. And certainly there would be an inconsistency with the version of Mr. Daisel, as well as that of Brigadier Patel, who put the body approximately 3 meters or 10 feet from the edge of the building. In scenario 5, you put the distance from the edge of the building, the horizontal distance traveled at 4.2 meters. And can you just remind us what the orientation of the body would have been on landing?
So the aerodynamic coefficients that I used would have been in line with the body parallel to the building and falling horizontally, so side or stomach first,
right,
impacting the ground.
Right.
So either he's one side or his stomach.
So unlike what Mr. Daisel says, instead of the head facing the building, it would be pointing towards the double-decker highway.
Yes.
And that would be the same in respect of scenario 6, except the horizontal distance traveled would only be just over 1.2 meters.
Yep.
In your recollection of the scene outside of that southern wing of John Vorster Square, would that have taken Mr. Timol just beyond that, what looks like a gutter, but we're told is in fact is a light tunnel, but it does have sharp concrete edges? Would that have taken Mr. Timol slightly beyond that structure?
Based on my memory, I think that structure is about 1 meter away from the building. I did not measure it, so I would not know. But I would think if it's 1.2 or 1.3 meters away, it could take him beyond that structure into the area.
We are locating the building plan, so eventually we'll get the exact measurements. The point I'm making is that we're of the belief that had he fallen onto that light well or light tunnel that looks like a gutter, then his injuries would have been substantially different, because he likely would have fallen on concrete and probably would have hit one or more of those sharp edges, and then his injuries would have been very, very different indeed. All right, Mr. Mudley, please continue with taking us through your report.
I think, having been through everything, the 6 scenarios, I would say that each of these scenarios that I've presented here, mathematically and from a mathematical model perspective, are correct. I would like to have believed that the way Mr. Timol had launched himself during the jump is in line with what most people would do when intending to jump. I would like to also believe that the evidence of Daisel with his body, where the head was pointing towards the direction, would have been the aftermath of somebody somersaulting through the air, perpendicular to it. But having gone through everything, I think that somebody jumping out of the window and only landing 3 meters away is not possible. They would have definitely landed at least between 4.5 meters and 13 meters, like I said. The Daisel's version, I think is possible if we knew what, and if we had enough evidence of how the person left the body. If we had photographic evidence or something like that, it would have been possible. And so is Rodriguez, based on the scenarios that I put together. The question is, whose version over there is the most plausible version? And having said that, I don't think in scenarios 5 and 6 that Mr. Timol would have been able to launch himself into that orientation given the construction of that window that was there. So that's basically my 6 scenarios. I think one can read them themselves into what they see. But yeah, I have nothing further to say.
I see. Mr. Mudley, finally, I wish to return to what allegedly took place in room 1026. You have before you the photograph, which is exhibit C8, and I believe that you have now been given the an English translation of the magistrate's finding. Your Lordship, for the record, the original version is in volume A from page 1121. The English translation is also in volume A at, it's right at the back. I haven't been given a page number, but it's right behind the original Afrikaans version. And we're interested in looking at the description, the summing up of the evidence by the magistrate in relation to what happened in room 1026. And in the English translation, that's at page 28. Mr. Timol, do you have that? No. I thought you said you had.
The copy that I have is not numbered. The English translation is not numbered.
Oh, is it not numbered?
Yeah, it's not numbered. What is numbered, however, is the version, the Afrikaans version.
Yes, it's unfortunate that it's not numbered. So if you can just, my Lord, count 28 pages from the beginning of the English translation, and unfortunately there are no headings to guide us either, so one actually has to count 28 pages. The top line reads, he said that he sat down on a chair. Mr. Mudley, have you found the correct page?
Yes, I have.
Okay. My Lord, have you found the page?
No,
not yet.
No, not yet.
On page 27, there are 2 headings, the court adjourned, the court reconvened.
Page?
Well, I suppose that would be page 27. It's not in bold, it's just in capital letters.
No, I don't think, because there are no... No, I'm unable to get that, but proceed. proceed.
Okay. And my Lord, I'm going to read out the passage, so if that helps. And I think we must number the pages. Perhaps we can attend to that after we adjourn. Mr. Mudley, I want to revisit what happened in room 1026. According to the summing up of the evidence that Magistrate de Villiers provided in respect of the evidence given by Sergeant Rodriguez. And the idea here is then to ask you, in relation to the findings of the magistrate, how long you believe it would have taken Mr. Timol to execute those moves. So I'm reading now from the top of page 28, and this is the summing up of the magistrate's finding in relation to, or the summing up of Rodriguez's evidence as provided by Magistrate de Villiers. He said that he sat down on a chair on the southern side of the table, the chair that Gloy had just vacated. Furthermore, on the photo, Exhibit S, and I believe that to be the photo that we have provided in C8, a photo of the room and its contents, the witness said that he was sitting on chair A. You see that in the photo, Mr. Mudley?
Yes.
While the deceased sat on chair B, a little while after Gloy and Van Niekerk had gone out, that's out the room, the deceased asked to go to the toilet. The deceased was sitting on chair B. As I have already mentioned, both of them got up. Rodriguez said he went to the left, and I presume that's his left, where chair C was in his way. At that moment, his eyes were on the chair. That's chair C. He pushed it in, and then he saw the deceased. He was standing on the right-hand side of the table from where Rodriguez was, rushing towards the window. The witness said he first wanted to go to the left, but the chair that the deceased had just vacated, chair B, would have been in his way, and he went back to the right, where he had trouble with chair A, which was in his way. At this moment, the deceased was already at the window. The window was already open, and he was busy diving through the window. In an attempt to grab the deceased, he stumbled over chair A. He could not even touch the deceased. When he got to the window, he said that he saw the deceased lying on the ground next to the building. He immediately ran to Colonel Greyling's office to report, and that part of the summing up is not relevant for our purposes. So, Mr. Mudley, if we were to ask you to give an estimation, in your view, of the time it took Mr. Timol to execute those moves, starting from his position in seat B and eventually ending up at the window and exiting that window, would you still say that it was, I think your evidence earlier was between 5 and 8 seconds?
So, in my evidence earlier, I basically assumed that he had moved in the direction of the door and then basically moved towards his, Mr. Timol's, left, which is to exit the left window. If he had just moved from the chair directly around the table into that direction and still climb up to get out of that window, I would be more inclined to confirm around 5 seconds, maybe 4 to 6 seconds. I can't see him being able to do that in a shorter period of time, because there's a lot of changing of direction in movement. Left, then right, and then up. And every change in movement requires some sort of time and some sort of difference in reaction. So when you think about how we move, we react according to what our brain would tell us to move, right? And there's a period where we think about a reaction and then we execute it. And when we look at accidents on people driving, they always consider a reaction time before the person actually applies his brake. In a similar way, for somebody to change direction, he would have to process the information that he wants to change direction and then execute it, that he's going to change direction. So that there is a time frame to that. It doesn't happen instantaneously.
Thank you. Your Lordship, no further questions.
Thank you. Advocate Yes. Yes, Advocate.
I do have questions. Thank you. I understand, and I was not present, but that witness Patel testified that the body was lying plus minus 10 feet away from the building. Transferring into meters, that is about 3 meters, more or less 3 meters. If one look at the scenarios that you have established with regard to the distance of 3 meters, it seems to me that your scenario 3 more or less has 3 meters, your scenario 4 has 3 meters, and for that purpose, your scenario 2 has got 4 meters. That is the scenarios that you, and the scenarios of 3 meters, would that is possibly then within what Patel has testified. Now, you must just answer. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
So then Dr. Naidu testified that the deceased fell head first, according to his opinion, head first, and then to the right shoulder, transferring the body. Would that have made a difference to you if you knew that, or if you take that into account?
So in scenario 3, I did take into consideration a somersault maneuver, which means that he would have rotated out the window in a head-first position, but he would have completed a full rotation, which have then resulted in landing on his stomach.
Now, with regard to the flight time, in other words, the time of the duration in air, mid-air, it seems to me in scenario 1 is the maximum time, which is about just over 3.5 seconds. And that's more or less the longest period that you anticipate that he might have been falling.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Now, if one take that into account, and one take into account Advocate Mattis's observation through the window, and you've seen also the sizes of these windows, how long observation would you have had of the falling body?
I don't have it on me here, but he would have fallen at a few meters per second, definitely more than the height of, so you would have seen it within less than a second, the body passing there, because he would have fallen much more than 1.5 meters, much faster than 1.5 meters per second, which is the height of the window.
Yes. So it would have been less than a second observation.
Yeah.
Yes. And speaking of that, you have referred to the reaction time, and it seems to me that from your CV and what you've said, that you also do some accident reconstructions. Do you do that?
I don't do accident reconstruction, but what I do is engineering analysis of vehicles, suspension systems, braking systems, to see how effective vehicles can maneuver at high speeds.
If I may ask you, do you know what is the average reaction time of a person? In other words, if I notice something from noticing something to reaction time, what would that be, the delay?
If you're driving and you're paying attention, right, it could be between, I would say, 0.4 and 0.5 seconds. If you're not paying attention, it could be a little bit longer.
It could be longer. Yeah. If we look, for example, at Sergeant Rodriguez, his reaction time, you would not be able to say what would be a person beginning to leave an office with the purpose of leaving an office. What would his reaction time have been?
No, I couldn't say that.
Thank you. So have you done any, and I appreciate your graphs and the maths involved in the graphs, have you done any actual testing, for example, with crash test dummies in the falling trajectories of that form or that type of substance?
No, not within this time frame that we had, but the paper that we used experimental data combined with computational fluid dynamics data to work out the drag effect on the body. So another point that I want to raise is this. When the body fell, the fact that it started with the initial condition of a zero velocity, it took time to accelerate to higher speeds, and the body fell mostly with the gravitational force, and the aerodynamics forces and stuff was not as large as the rotational forces, unlike in a situation where somebody is skydiving and they have hundreds of meters in which to maneuver in.
Yes. And obviously it would also be different for people, for example, that do cliff diving or do
skydiving,
where they will purposely project themselves as far away from the cliff to do skydiving or whatever they do.
Yes.
So then, with regard to these graphs and the maths that you have applied there must be some variables that would influence all of these aspects. Have you considered any variables, for example, the clothing, whether something else is on the way down, hit like a ledge or anything like that? Have you taken any of those into account?
In this particular, at this particular speeds, the clothing effect would form what we call a profile drag effect, right? These speeds are still too low for that to be considered as any sort of additional restraint or additional drag coefficient or, have any value to it.
And just one issue, and I've asked this because I haven't been to that area and I haven't inspected. Are there protruding ledges from the building?
From when we looked out the window that we saw, currently there is a louver sort of face that was installed afterwards, I believe, but the building is almost flat. So if there's anything that's protruding, I wouldn't think it would be more than 100 millimeters. There's no balconies or anything below it or anything. It's almost a flat face.
So you've referred to the parapet wall on the roof.
Yes.
What is the height of the parapet?
It's between about, I would say, 300 and 500 millimeters. It's about knee height for me.
Thank you, my Lord. I have dealt with questions now.
Yes. Any further questions?
My Lord, just one. For purposes of clarification, Mr. Moodley, it was put to you that, by my learned friend for the police, that according to Dr. Naidu, Mr. Timol fell head first. Do you have a copy of of Dr. Naidu's report with you?
Not on hand.
Not on hand. In fact, at paragraph 22 of Dr. Naidu's report, exhibit number? We'll get you the exhibit number shortly. It's exhibit C3, my lord. His evidence is not quite that he fell head first, as in straight down. In fact, he says as follows: my impressions obtained from the injuries are that the body struck the ground, primary impact, with the forehead and the area of the right shoulder, elbow, chest. And if I recall his oral testimony, he said the body struck the ground in a side position, striking initially the areas that I've just mentioned. If you wish to comment on that, you may.
If you could ask a question, then maybe I could answer it, but I think you're making a statement.
I'm simply making a statement. If there's no comment, then we can leave it at that. Thank you, Lordship.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mondri. That will be all from you. Thank you very much. You want to say something?
No, thank you, my lord.
Oh, okay, thank you. You're excused. All right, Mr. Van.
Your Lordship, that concludes the evidence for today. Unless my learned colleagues have anything further. My Lord, the only thing that we can do is to assist you with your research is to hand up a numbered copy of the English translation of the inquest finding.
Yes, okay, thank you.
So, Your Lord, nothing further. I understand that my learned friend for the police will be calling certain witnesses for Monday and Tuesday.
Yes. Would you like to say something about that, Mr. Advocate?
My Lord, there's just one issue. As on the record yesterday at the closing that we were discussing the falling of Brigadier Chabalala. As we have discussed earlier in chambers, I've excused him as I don't believe it is necessary in the light of the affidavit that he presented to the court regarding Mr. Ahmed Adam. So I will not be calling him in this regard.
Yes.
And by Monday, I will be ready to present evidence.
Okay.
Thank you.
We're expecting 2 witnesses Monday.
Two witnesses.
That's Mr. Els and Mr. Rodriguez.
And Mr. Rodriguez will be present on Monday.
Yes. Are they still going by the titles, Sergeant Rodriguez or Mr. Rodriguez? You know.
Mr. Now, they haven't been in the police service for many years. They're not on the title or a rank.
Okay. Then we'll adjourn the proceedings until Monday, 10 o'clock in this room.